Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event, the February 6th Earthquakes, Survival, Disaster Capitalism, and the Right to Shelter. My name is Kate. I work at the People's Forum. If you haven't heard of us before, we're a political education center based in New York City. We have a bunch of offerings, including book talks, panels, conferences, everything from fashion shows to concerts, all dedicated to uplifting the culture and political education around working class liberation all over the world. We encourage you to follow us online. Even if you aren't based in New York City, you should certainly check out what we have going on because a lot of our offerings are hybrid, as you can tell. Today's event, of course, is of extreme urgency and importance to us, and it takes a really interesting angle in terms of making connections between struggles going on in New York and struggles going on in Turkey. And so that's all that the People's Forum is about, making those international solidarity connections to uplift working class people everywhere. I won't get too much into the Turkish context because we have a host of speakers and panelists who will be getting more in depth into it. But I just want to thank you all for joining us and welcome you to this space. But I'll hand it over to Besa. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kate. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for a panel on the February 6th earthquakes titled Survival, Disaster Capitalism, and the Right to Shelter. Before we delve into the discussion itself, I want to start by introducing the organizers behind this event. So this panel was organized by New York Earthquake Solidarity. New York Earthquake Solidarity is a group of students, workers, and artists from Turkey living in New York. And we formed this solidarity network in response to the devastating earthquakes that hit areas in Turkey, Kurdistan, and Syria on February 6th. Our main goal as a group is to raise funds for the urgent and ongoing need for humanitarian aid in the affected areas, while also mobilizing our allies to support the victims of the earthquakes. As a group, as New York Earthquake Solidarity, we frequently share campaigns, events, and updates on our social media accounts. So if you're interested in continuing your solidarity with us, please follow us on Twitter at NYEQ Solidarity and on Instagram at NY Earthquake Solidarity. If somebody could put that in the chat, it would be great so that people can have easy access to the handles. We are still actively collecting funds for the earthquake victims. As I mentioned, there's an ongoing need for continuous funding because it's a huge devastation and people are still in need of adequate shelter and food security. We urge you to donate the links that will be provided by the Research Institute on Turkey, which is a grassroots research cooperative based in New York City, and Heyvasor, which is the Kurdish Red Crescent. Our donations, the ones that were collected by us, will be sent to doctors' unions, bar associations, workers' unions, and civil society groups. So moving on to the panel itself, it will consist of 2 sessions. The first session will be a more academic heavy panel focused on disaster capitalism and the earthquake. And the second session will concentrate on housing justice, working class issues, and women's rights. The speakers will discuss the struggle against real estate lobbies for safe housing, reports from the disaster zone, and the situation of the working class and women of Turkey. And it is important to mention that both sessions include individuals who have directly experienced the earthquake or have spent time in the disaster zone in the aftermath. At the end of the session, the first session, we will have a 30-minute Q&A portion. So if you have a question for our panelists right after their discussion, we ask that you please hold on to your question until the end, and we will do our best to address every question during the Q&A session. Okay. So before getting to introducing our first speaker, I want to say that our final panelist for this first session, Hishiyar Özsoy, couldn't make it today due to a work-related emergency that he had to attend to. He's a deputy with the People's Democratic Party and it's election season. So things are very turbulent back in Turkey. So we wish him ease with his work. Our first panelist is Aslı Odman. We welcome her, a senior lecturer in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at Mimar Sinan Fine Arts University. Today in her talk, she will analyze previous states of emergency and rubble in Turkey, using the title State of Emergency and Rubble as both a metaphor and concrete reality. She will then discuss the concrete issues of new urban constructions after the recent earthquake and share her perspective based on her experience as a translator in field hospitals in the disaster zone for 2 weeks. So the floor is yours. Please begin when you're ready.
Yes, okay. So the sound was on centrally. Thank you. Do you hear me well from Istanbul? Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation. Well, I was worried when I heard the first panel will be an academic and theoretical one. I'm not sure whether I have the correct level of abstraction between my own experiences and bridge this towards, successful abstractions that can grasp them. So I really haven't found the correct level between experience and to make sense of what we are going through. Then I will base, in order to be sure, I will find the correct medium. I will try to keep to an imaginary. I will try to keep an imaginary, and I'm confident because we have here a worker from Mustafa from Soma. He was there in the rescue field. So we have a unionist. We have Mehmet from Antep. We have friends who are doing important collective women's work in the in and outside for so many years in all the communitarian contexts from Ekmek Gül. And so I think when this experience sharing phase will be weak in mine, it will be covered in theirs, at least those who are here immediately. I hope I haven't forgotten anyone who's been acting in the field, life-saving in the all meanings of the world. So my help, well, not to help you to follow better, but this is just to help me out to find the correct medium between experience, emotions, and making meaning of them, was an imaginary I was thinking of, combining what I was doing, how I was doing with rubble, how I was doing, how I was dealing with dead bodies before the earthquake, and so I'm going to try to transplant those insights from the period from the earthquake. So as Beyza told, I will base this imaginary on like two parts of a way, two parts of the or what constitutes a railway, a train that we have to stop. I have to tell it in right before. This is a train that is going faster and faster every day. And it's constituted, it's going on two, I don't know what's the English word is, rai. Beyza, can you help me with this? Rai.
Rail?
Rail, yes, but these two iron parts, you know, also symbols of capitalism since the beginning. So it's moving, marching faster and faster on two things that is more, both a metaphor, as you said, and concrete materiality, a rubble and state of emergency. That is what, on which grounds this train, this fast moving and always faster moving train is moving on. Rubble and state of emergency, both as a metaphor and a concrete reality. And this train comes from the period before the earthquake, passed through the station, disaster, natural disaster, earthquake, and still moving its way, heading its way towards it. So I'm really leaning towards towards this metaphor of Walter Benjamin, who described the revolution as stopping and handling this, you know, emergency stopping sign of a train. He didn't describe a revolution as something that has to speed, that is set something in the future, but something that has to happen now. And it's not something about acceleration, it's about stopping something. It's not about beautiful future imaginaries, but it's about stopping something. So this train that is going faster and faster, and I hope we should feel the emergency to stop it, but the real emergency is going on those two parts of this railway, constitute of rubble and state of emergency. So let me explain you how I define those 2 points, 2 parts. So the rubble before the earthquake, as I said, I'm going to lean on my experiences before the earthquake, where I make part of a network called Istanbul Health and Safety Labor Watch. We've been documenting since 2011 workers who die every day while working because of work, or because the way they work. Every day in Turkey, around 25 to 30 workers were dying. And if you look at why those workers die, we can't help seeing that how for example, the area of workers' health and safety has been liberalized, and the people who are supposed to inspect whether workers' health and safety, I mean, all the materials, chemical materials, production materials for capitalism, or the working conditions or the working hours are correct, those who are supposed to check this, to inspect this, they work for companies, for private companies, and they are supposed to check the workspaces they are paid by. So this impossibility of the free market system, that security, workers' health and safety has been transferred to the area of the free market, and those traditional institutions like chambers, who are supposed to deliver in the name of the constitution certificates, systems of inspection to provide for health and safety, has been removed from the system, including that their activist has been put with excuses in jail. So now we have the beautiful free market system that is supposed to provide the security that is getting more and more marketized, that is becoming an area that people can make a lot of money by just doing paperwork. So that's about creation of markets and delegating very crucial issues about all areas of human and ecological health to free market forces. Now switch, take the train and go forward. Next station after the earthquake, we'll look at the issue of the building inspection, building safeties. I don't mean that those are the only responsible. They are one chain within the huge chain of that makes up the chain of the responsibles and the criminals. The building inspection system and the laboratories who go for them, they are doing the same things. They are supposed to deliver at least 4 different stages of the construction of a building, that it's okay, its basis, its foundational rules, they obey the statics of the construction engineering or the material like concrete and still go with them. They have to check the building at 4 points. They send samples to laboratories. It's the same thing. They are paid for, the construction companies. They are supposed to check. So this is a free market system where any security, any inspection is not, no inspection is possible. So this is the line that moves from workers' health and safety up to the, again, environmental safety, the regulations about environmental appropriateness. They are all delivered by free market forces, free market organs, whereby organs, at least nominally, relatively independent organs like chambers have been removed to the margins of the system and criminalized. So this is one way about, so it's basing the system, the real state of emergency where at least 30 people were dying under the conditions of peace. I'm not talking about war conditions. I'm talking about something that the industrial sociology is called the normal conditions of working. In the normal conditions of working every day through the many sectors, fast-moving sectors of the Turkey, 30 people were dying. And unless because we were not able to look into the face of this real state of emergency, this necropolitical regimes, now we are confronted with the loss of the soul people. Still, we are so angry that those people, most of the people who could have been saved by having safer buildings, by having obeyed the scientific rules of how to construct, at least again by obeying the rules of saving lives after an earthquake, and now still going on with the problem of toxic chemical materials and asbestos-laden rubble. So there is a line that goes from a non-confronted everyday state of emergency moving to the state of emergency. But what happens when we cannot confront and say, the state of emergency, this is the issue of the Kurds, the state of emergency, this is the issue of the terrorists. So if we accept that the powerful regime declares the state of emergency, it just doesn't apply to all of us, but to a specific region, like it was the case. The solution of the state of emergency was deployed in the Kurdish regions. Then it came through the 2016 coup d'etat attempt to Istanbul, and it has been used. So then look at the real definition, the regulation of state of the declared state of emergency. Now we have a declared state of emergency in the earthquake zone, 2020, since the 24th of February. It's called afet bölgelerinde. So it's a state of emergency concerning the 11 provinces of Turkey, including Diyarbakır, where only nominally 17 buildings have collapsed, and Adana, where 7 buildings have collapsed. But the whole almighty powers and state of emergency regulation of this presidential decree applies to all the limits of those 11 provinces. What happens with the declaration of the powerful of the state of emergency is something that was happening all the way before. So I'm working in urban planning. This is exactly the context where the urban transformation in peaceful times started, using the pretext of the earthquake. The presidential decree of the 24th of February says that no, there's no property security. So anyone who lives in this zone and having property will have to accept that sometime, even if its building has been not decimated to rubble, not that much damage. So the state has all this almighty powers to confiscate, in the name of the public good, any property in the earthquake region. Not talking about the people who have to rent buildings. You know, we're talking about the bourgeois property rights. I mean, imagine those who didn't even have access to property rights. We're talking about a family from Samandağ who had access to property rights, had been living there for 200 years, from chain to chain, from generation to generation. On a specific, well, let's put the story in the scale of a specific family. You lose your loved ones. In Yusuf Amca, in Samandağ, has lost its loved ones during the earthquake. Not going into the details whether this was, how natural this was. Okay, then its property has been decimated to rubble. What comes is the state comes and confiscates on the basis of the presidential decree, because it's in the public good. They can use, he loses its naked property and says, and now we're building some earthquake housing somewhere we've chosen. With the same presidential decree, the whole planning process, at least the whole planning process has to take into consideration scientific issues like, you know, where to settle down, geological criterion, social justice, environmental sustainability. That's what we are teaching our students, no? All the planning process with rights to protest have been annulled. So it has been the whole housing construction process has been decimated to a technical process where some architectural companies and the usual suspects who have been already building all over the Turkey, the biggest fish in the after construction industry, they make big business associations, they are closed, there are green ones or there are red ones, there are, I mean, Islamic capital or non-Islamic capital, doesn't matter, they are the bigger actors. They have already got the auctions, they have won in the auctions, they've already started to build these new buildings without taking into consideration, without any planning process, without any due process to geological criterion, whether the state has got the right to confiscate also agricultural land, forest land, lands of pasture land. So, and then second thing, that family from Samandağ has to live somewhere, except to live somewhere that hasn't chosen to live, is not even sure whether this time it will be okay, it will be ecologically sustainable. And the second is they don't get this building earthquake housing unit, not for free, they are indebted. They have to pay the state this amount on long term. And if they cannot pay this back, then they lose the building. So at so many levels they have lost. So this is the state of emergency, the implications of state of emergency, but we knew this from the at least 2012 disaster law has innovated the system of transferring of property to the treasury. The Ministry of Urbanism and Environment had the overall rights to confiscate rapidly property anywhere in Turkey in order for the pretext of the earthquake, or the Ministry of Transportation for the sake of big mega projects that have pulled more construction effects towards itself. So there's again in the strain moving from state of emergencies developed in other first smaller regions, Kurdish regions first, and in other contexts. And when we were not able to fight them successfully, they're coming back to us in the earthquake. The last thing is certainly the cultural, the rubble, it's another rubble, certainly, the cultural heritage. So what happened, for example, I give an example from the city where I live in Istanbul. We have a totally gentrified process where arts and is used in order to make Disneyland kind of kitsch cultural reconstructions for the sake of kind of a tourism. It's a Beyoğlu cultural route. It is such a construction. Or take another state of emergency like Sur becoming Toledo, kind of fetishizing some aspects of the history and using it for tranquilizing, but also commodifying what means cultural heritage defined by the state for the market. So we fear that in most of the historical centers, with the overall rights of confiscation of property, this is what's going to happen with some artistic touch and with some architect touch. This is what is going to happen. But this is another continuity. So I'm talking a lot about continuity. The last one is certainly the concrete rubble. The concrete rubble we were dealing with, because during the declared urban transformation, consecutive urban transformation, the heated construction sector, at least 1,000 buildings were destroyed under peaceful times in Turkey, with all the asbestos dust. Nothing it was not taken care of. And now in the earthquake, so we have the rubble. We've been documented how what kind of a crime they constitute, or more than 10 areas where they push this rubble. I don't want to talk about the body parts of the people who are still there. I'm going to talk technically about what a disaster rubble contains compared to any other type of rubble, also as concrete material. I mean, this is an industrial, it's also industrial zone. We call them Anatolian tigers, Antep, Marash. So it's full of also workspaces. There are logistical warehouses, houses. Not only asbestos, we're talking about chemical materials. We're talking about heavy leaded paints like lead paint. We're talking about petroleum stations. This is a mix of so many things that has been mainly now dumped into river basins, very near to the people who, to the settlement of the peoples, to schools, to mosques, to any other areas, very close to agricultural lands. So through the underwater and through the food chain, they are spreading the problem. The disasters has been spread over the time and over different spaces, including certainly not Turkey, but this is the direction of where waters flow towards Syria and Iraq. So spreading a problem geographically, etc. That said, this is another example where the train has started its past journey with the contaminated rubble that has dumped. I mean, Yenikule protestation area that has dumped landfills. It has used to be a landfill. It has already caused the cancer of so many people in all the cities. So it meant always rubble. Any construction process meant also this. So I can only make sense, and those are my last words, of the rubble and the state of emergency we're facing with, and the necessity to stop this train that is walking on these two Schienen in German. I can't remember, two iron parts that this train is moving. There we should look the continuities into the face, get organized, the different people who are looking into the different areas of rubble, women's rights, workers' rights, rights of the Kurdish people, rights of the ecological rights, people who've been working separately in those areas. I think this is what we're sharing. We're sharing this fast train, we're sharing the rubble and the state of emergency, and we should really find very concrete areas of cooperation and get well together before we've been squeezed between the earthquake and elections, the bureaucratical workings of so we can't do with another train, we can't do with a different pace of the train. We have to stop the train. Thank you very much for giving the words.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your insightful discussion. And with that, again, if you have questions at this point, please hold on to them and we'll get back to them at the end. So our next panelist is Harun Ercan. Harun is a PhD candidate in sociology at SUNY Binghamton University, specializing in the sociology of the state, war and conflict, authoritarianism, social movements, race, and ethnicity. First, he will examine how the government was able to implement disaster capitalism. Then he will emphasize that the main issue in Turkey is not simply corruption, but the chosen accumulation economic model. He will conclude by examining the potential for intervention in parallel with possible changes of power in the political field, in addition to solidarity in the short and medium term struggle against this trend. So please proceed when you're ready.
Hi everyone. First of all, thanks a lot for giving me opportunity to speak in this panel. I'm going to come up with three main arguments in order to explain first how disaster capitalism has been working in Turkey in the last 10 years. Second, I will try to get into details of the power block that is currently running the disaster capitalism in Turkey. Then last, I will try to show how the left can use the upcoming elections as an opportunity to make a real difference. I think to understand what has been happening in Turkey in the last 15 days, we first need to talk about a strategic dynamic, which what I call as kind of coercive pacification campaigns run by the government. I think this is essential for disaster capitalism in Turkey to survive. And also it is essential for Erdogan to be able to launch the new mega project that he announced right after the earthquakes. So let me remind you that he promised the people in Turkey and also the earthquake victims that in 1 year he's going to rebuild all those kind of these devastated kind of buildings. I think to be able to understand how and why government has been acting in this way, we need to first accept the fact that from the day one, the Erdogan and the government in general, they treated the earthquakes as a political emergency rather than a humanitarian. This is in line with this logic. The government treated this as a kind of political competition for legitimacy. So from the day one, their main concern was the fact that opposition and the left might garner popular support after the failed state response. I think that what has been happening in the last 50 days seems to be consistent with Erdogan's overly politicized conception of state of emergency. Aslı has already mentioned, kind of reflected on this, and I'm going to try to explain this a bit further, briefly. So what happened in the last 10 years in Turkey is, and we are talking about an authoritarian state transformation that has primarily focused on bolstering coercive state institutions such as police, military, and intelligence at the expense of those performing non-coercive functions like disaster management agencies, kind of education and health. So of course, this kind of repertoire of conflict management, I think, comes from a series of collective contentious events, including the Gezi and Kobani uprisings in 2013 and 14, urban warfare in the Kurdish region in 2015 and 16, and coup attempt that came right after that, as well as 3 cross-border military operations that Turkish government has launched in Syria. So we are talking about continuous pacification campaigns that not only tries to silence the opposition, but also creates necessary conditions for what I call as coercive accumulation. So I think this is quite an important word. The way that capitalism has been functioning in Turkey, especially in the last 10 years, seems to require us to come up with some new concepts in order to understand what's going on. So I'm using this term in order to refer to both kind of formal and informal mechanisms that government has activated in order to make neoliberal capitalism survive in Turkey. When we try to kind of delve into the functions of this coercive pacification campaigns in the context of the earthquakes, we see that it is mainly being used to militarize the quake areas. That's one of the first practices that government has committed to right after the earthquakes. So the second thing has been trying to drive out the solidarity networks. So the left quickly got mobilized quite quickly, and they rescued kind of many people. And also they have been one of the both Turkish and Kurdish left. They have been in the kind of region, and the government definitely does not seem to be happy with this because they consider this as a kind of something that erodes the legitimacy of the government. So therefore, they have been blocking aid mobilized by mutual aid organizations and also political parties in opposition. And maybe, I mean, it's also important to ask the following question: how can government launch this pacification campaigns with minimal cost? In addition to providing shelter for the earthquake victims, one of the main sources of legitimacy for this pacification campaigns comes from, I think, already existing ethno-racial hierarchies in Turkey. So structural racism is embedded within the government's playbook to deal with public emergencies. So let me remind you that when all people in Turkey are trying to mobilize aid on social media, the government was experiencing a serious crisis of legitimacy. And in order to overcome this problem in the short term, they claim that the looting is the most serious problem in the quaked areas. We also should not forget the fact that this was used to justify, to declare a state of emergency in the quaked areas by Erdogan. And in other words, the government claimed that there's a kind of danger, that there was not a kind of real danger. And then they claimed to be solution for this quote unquote security question by trying to exploit law and order politics. So I think we should not forget the fact that the legitimacy for this pacification campaigns also comes from kind of structural racism embedded within the government response, and also these kind of disasters. So my second point is going to be about we will try to touch upon the question of how actually the government can swiftly organize some sort of kind of elite collective action to make disaster capitalism survive. I think this is one of the things that has kind of maybe kind of baffled the opposition in Turkey, because from this day too, the government started kind of to cut deals with major construction companies in Turkey. But I think it will be a mistake to think that we are only talking about the government and the capitalists. We are talking about a coalition that seems to be larger than that. We are talking about Islamic NGOs working on the field, some kind of tarikats, we can also call them. We are talking about a lot of kind of a number of secular business elites in this kind of power block. We are also talking about state officials in key positions, and also even some political parties in opposition. I'm talking about the opposition that runs on a racist political agenda and fearful of the possibility that Arabs and the Kurds might demographically dominate those quaked areas. So we are talking about quite a kind of some sort of an elite collective action led by Erdogan, and this coalition has been acting quite swiftly. So maybe it's time to ask the following question: where does, let's say, the government's know-how, or let's say institutional kind of repertoire of action comes from? I think in addition to this urban renewal projects that was run in Istanbul, in Bursa, in many parts of kind of Turkey, I think if you are talking about a disaster in such scale, the main political know-how comes from what happened in 2015 and 16 in the Kurdish region of Turkey. So disaster capitalism at large scale was practiced after the urban warfare that took place in the Kurdish region. And I think what is happening right now in the last 50 days in the quaked areas is some sort of a kind of boomerang effect. And the government is mobilizing for this mega project because they have already done this in the Kurdish region. And they will already have an idea about the outcomes of such kind of such disaster capitalism. So the urgent confiscation of the land affected by the war was one of the main practices used. In addition to that, dispossession of the people was the second outcome, and the demographic engineering was the third component of these projects. So right now, when you look at those cities affected, war-torn cities in the Kurdish region, when you look at Sur, Şırnak, Cizre, Yüksekova, Aslı already kind of mentioned kind of the realities of Sur. But when you think about the Kurdish region in general, it seems like they have already they are using those kind of plans that had been employed in the Kurdish region in order to rebuild the quaked areas. And we should not forget the fact that there are some populations in this region, ethnically kind of subjugated populations, and they are being considered as a kind of threat against the long-term state objectives. And we can say that this disaster capitalism seems to kind of work in the last 50 days without, despite the opposition ongoing. But I think what happened in the Kurdish region might not repeat in these quake-affected areas, because we are talking about a real kind of and powerful solidarity networks being established in the last 50 days. So I believe that there's a structural opportunity for the left to intervene into the kind of the operations of the disaster capitalism that's going on right now. So I think this brings us to my third point, which is we need to talk about the institutional context a little bit, and in order to see what kind of quote unquote monster that we are talking about, and how can, and I'm also going to try to come up with some ideas about how to resist to disaster capitalism in Turkey. I think when we analyze how the earthquakes in Turkey, Syria, and Kurdistan have been debated, especially in among the English-speaking community, we see that the corruption argument usually coming up, and I think this is kind of misleading to an extent, because we are talking about an economic growth model that was chosen by the AKP government in order to make profits quickly, and we forget the fact that we are not just talking about it's just a kind of policy choice. We are also talking about a number of institutional arrangements made in the last 2 decades to facilitate disaster capitalism in Turkey. So even if the government will be replaced by the opposition in the elections that is going to take place in 50 days, those institutional arrangements made in the last, especially in the last decade, are going to remain intact. So we need to, let me give you an example in order to explain what concretely I'm referring to. Just think about how this disaster capitalism has been organized kind of locally. It's enough to look at how municipal law has been amended in the last 15 years. Just think about district level municipalities. So the government deliberately did not provide sufficient funds to local municipalities. And in order to make them reliant upon these kind of money or funds that they can get through construction of new buildings, and they're kind of being too flexible about systemic kind of violations, code violations, zoning violations. So these municipalities, even those who have been kind of run by the opposition parties, they had to somehow be too flexible about the impositions of the central government. And that's why we are talking about a kind of a structural dynamic and a set of institutional arrangements in place. And therefore, they are going to remain in place even if the AKP government is going to lose elections. So therefore, I believe when we think about how can the left intervene in this process, it looks like, I think the opposition, the National Alliance, it's called Millet İttifakı, they don't seem to have a complete plan regarding what they will do if they win the elections about the disaster capitalism problematic. As far as I can see, they have only mentioned that they will work with local construction companies rather than those crony capitalists who have been in alliance with the AKP in the last 20 years. So I think the government does not seem to, even if they have a complete plan, they haven't announced it so far. And I think this provides a structural opportunity for the left to intervene. And I feel like these mobilization networks, they can make kind of important pressures on the opposition if they win the elections, to create a new kind of understanding about stopping this disaster capitalism, and also coming up with a new kind of project or understanding or modality to rebuild those quaked areas. And this, I think, has to go in line with a public administration reform. So I think the only way to do this seems to be kind of possible if democratic decentralization is being adopted and digested or internalized by the kind of the solidarity networks and the left in general in Turkey. And this, by creating some sort of a radical flank effects, the left in Turkey can somehow put a lot of pressure on the now opposition, maybe kind of the government in the near future, and they can kind of first halt this the way that the elite collective action is being kind of practiced in the quaked areas, and then we can have a more kind of create conditions for democratic discussions, for a participatory and democratic discussion about how to move on, and in a way that is not going to repeat what happened in the Kurdish region after the urban warfare, which was kind of simply dispossession and also kind of making people kind of indebted and to the banks. And so I think while we are contemplating on what comes next, we should not, I mean, we all, I think all people in this panel, they are aware of how critical is, how the solidarity networks are critical, how the left fighting on the streets for the collective rights of the earthquake victims are doing an amazing and important job. But I think there's sometimes kind of overemphasis on the solidarity networks makes us forget the fact that we are talking about structures that will be still in place if the government loses the elections. So therefore, we should also start coming up with some plans about how to undo those institutional arrangements that makes disaster capitalism survive. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate your valuable contribution. So with that, I will be moving on to introducing our third and final panelist for this first session, Hazal Hürman. Hazal is an anthropology PhD candidate at Princeton University, specializing in anthropology of childhood and political and legal anthropology. And today she will discuss her observations specific to Antep, which is one of the cities that was affected by the earthquakes, such as the temporary sheltering crisis in the affected areas, deepening ethno-racial hierarchies, and the consequences of a construction-led growth model. So the floor is yours, Hazal, when you're ready.
Thank you so much. I will try to share my screen. And yes, I hope you can see it right now. Okay, thank you. And thank you for bringing us together for discussing the ongoing disaster. And just to give a background to my reflections today, the earthquakes caught me in the middle of my ethnographic dissertation research in Antep, right by the epicenter. My dissertation research seeks to, or used to, foreground children's experiences as a route to understand ethno-racial sensibilities and political anxieties as they are reconfigured in contemporary Turkey. It does so, or used to do so, ironically enough, with a focus on the built environment as a prominent site where the childhood and state ideologies crystallize. In other words, during the couple of months predating the earthquakes, I have been focusing on how children of different backgrounds in their daily repertoires activate, navigate, challenge, or adapt ideologies of statehood and childhood that are archived in physical space. Now, with the houses I visited shattered or damaged, the neighborhoods that I once focused on deserted and abandoned, my research took an unexpected turn that I'm yet to formulate. To add to the irony of my personal relationship to the earthquakes, my own childhood has also been largely defined by an earthquake, the 1999 Marmara earthquake, which destroyed my childhood house in Yalova. At the intersection of my research interests and my own experiences, I now took a pause from the research I initially planned in favor of taking part in relief efforts and tracing the experience of children in the earthquake-affected areas. And this has been what I have been doing for a month and a half. So what I will share today will be in the form of raw observations from the field, rather than more micro-level conceptual reflections as to the nature of natural and political disaster. I'm aware that this first session is designed to be more academic in nature, but following Aslı, torn between personal experiences and abstraction, I take the critical social scientists' warnings against the tendency to aestheticize or over-theorize the tragedy, overlooking the crude and intimate forms of violence intrinsic to it as a precept. Hence, I will try to document the daily experiences of tragedy that continues to unfold. With that, I hope I can provide a description, albeit limited, of how the crisis and the broader categories we think within the social sciences are being experienced by diverse groups in the earthquake-affected areas. Increasingly becoming convinced of the importance of archiving the intricate ways in which disaster capitalism reproduces itself, while simultaneously exacerbating ethno-racial and class hierarchies that Harun also mentioned, my attempt will be to describe briefly how the politics of disaster unfolds in the aftermath of the earthquake, particularly in Antep. Like many people in Antep, I threw myself out of the building with the first quake, assuming that my apartment somehow survived, but I will face a destroyed city. To our astonishment, this was not the case, as the city center of Antep is relatively standing still in comparison to the rest of the affected cities. On the other hand, two large districts of Antep, Nurdu and Islahiye, are among the areas hit hardest, being almost totally demolished. Even as the city center Antep is relatively unharmed in terms of number of the collapsed buildings, together with the demolished Islahiye and Nurda, it is a site of humanitarian and political crisis today. The astonishment of having survived, many of us experienced during the first couple of hours following the earthquake, the initial one, is soon replaced by anger, and only anger, even surpassing the fear and grief in the midst of the political disaster. In the city center Antep, the most affected area in terms of the physical damage is called Ibrahimli, which to date has been considered to be the modern, fancy, upper-class residential area of the city center. In contrast to the relatively older structuring of the city built on a rocky terrain, Ibrahimli has been open to construction in recent years by drying up the marsh areas. Today, Ibrahimli is a ghostly neighborhood, as many who used to live there had the means to flee to either surrounding cities or village houses they own. But even though most buildings collapsed are located in Ibrahimli, a number of buildings located in other neighborhoods are also reported to be moderately and severely damaged. Initially, the plan declared by the Ministry of Environment and Urban Planning was that those moderately damaged buildings were to be reinforced. But a recent official statement suggests that they will be demolished together with those severely damaged. In the long run, this will introduce a larger number of households into the reconstruction efforts while also putting them into debt to the state. In the short run, one immediate problem facing those living in the city center Antep is the lack of temporary sheltering. The relatively minor physical harm visible to eye in the city center is instrumentalized by the local authorities to neglect the popular demand for temporary sheltering. There were only 3 relatively symbolic tent areas in the city center, accommodating approximately 2,000 people in a city center of approximately 2 million. With the logic of what I can only describe as out of sight, out of mind, local authorities are employing a discourse of immediate return to normal, dislocating those staying in tents from the urban spaces. This no-tent policy proves, of course, hardest for those who do not have the means to flee the city center, but have been living in the houses that are now moderately and severely damaged and to be demolished. Particularly in the majority Kurdish upper hills of Antep, many families are forced into damaged buildings for not having access to temporary sheltering areas, making ongoing aftershocks even riskier for many. This, for instance, is an image of a severely damaged building to be demolished, where people were still staying due to lack of temporary sheltering as of March the 1st. In the neighborhoods populated largely by Syrian refugees or Roma and Dom populations, people do not mostly have access to official damage assessment reports. We have seen several times these groups being harassed by local security officials, requesting them to remove the tents they built in the city center. Many times, those refusing to return to their damaged houses are pushed towards the outskirts of the city with no access to electricity, water, or sanitation. Following the logic of out of sight, out of mind, local authorities in one-to-one conversations stress how much state-level visitors Antep is receiving nowadays and complain how the visibility of such populations at the city center harm the image of the city. The same officials also shared the opinion that the refugees, Roma and Dom populations are not earthquake victims, but are just the poor of the city who have always been in need. This logic defines the living conditions of the earthquake survivors in destroyed Islahiye and Nurdağı as well. In one of our visits to the temporary sheltering area in Nurdağı with a local NGO providing humanitarian help, the authorities welcomed the volunteers of the NGO, stating, quote, "This place is just for you, fit for your work. The only problem is that there are no earthquake victims," unquote. These non-victim victims staying in the tents are Roma and Dom populations who have historically been living in the district and also lost their houses. But to the authorities, quote, "They just like living in the tents, is part of their culture." This logic, of course, is not harmful simply in a discursive level, but shape how the authorities manage the population in temporary sheltering areas and beyond. A couple of weeks ago, for instance, some residents of state-provided tents are relocated to containers in Nurdağı, and the area was ornamented by trees brought from outside just before the visit of President Erdogan. A square is designed almost like a carnival area with even a small zoo installed next to the Quran courses and Unified Turkey Middle School. Who were left outside of the container area to be visited were the Syrian refugees and Roma and Dom population. Instead, their tents were removed and dislocated to an area that is further away from the site of official visits. The limited service by the waste of the developing container city and the excavation vehicles. Of course, all the official visits in Antep has the square I mentioned as their sole address where the statehood is staged. Likewise, among the two temporary sheltering areas composed of tents in Islahiye, one was designed only for locals, not letting Syrian refugees in, leaving them in makeshift tents they made themselves in different parts of the district, as the one shown in the visual. The other mixed sheltering complex, on the other hand, is prone to tension. All the tents in the area are marked by number 1 or 2, number 1s belonging to Turkish citizens and number 2s to Syrian refugees. The lines for receiving food are also distinct for Turkish citizens and Syrian refugees. On top of this, the Syrians are repeatedly being told that they all will be dislocated to another temporary sheltering area in Nizip at the other edge of the city. Having lived for more than 10 years in these districts, they now, as one Syrian woman also states, have massive graveyards of their lost ones in these districts and are here to stay close to them. The refugees are also concerned that their dislocation to Nizip will be beginning of a process of their repatriation. It is also vital noting here that Islahiye is a majority Kurdish district. Historically a marsh area as well, the land was dried up in the 1950s to be open to agricultural production, and the fragility of the ground for potential earthquakes have been reported repeatedly. The logic of construction-led growth model of the government is facilitated in the region by the near zoning plans implemented in the 2000s, opening the district to construction of high-rises. Many Kurds who started owning apartments from the buildings constructed over the last 10 years are now left without houses, but debts they borrowed to become homeowners. Overall, the residential areas built over the last 10 years under the scope of the shifts in urban planning, in line with the government's construction-led growth model, were hit hardest in Antep. This damage over a night left lower middle classes homeless but indebted, in contrast with their social and residential mobility aspirations. Others, refugees and poorer ethno-racial minorities who never had access to newly emerging residential areas, are today denied even the earthquake victim status. Forced either into their damaged houses and or tents without access to pretty limited services provided in temporary sheltering areas, they are waiting concerned about the next potential displacement for natural or political causes. One last thing I probably should add, based on my observations on different sites of Antep as well as Hatay over the last month and a half, is that it is pretty hard to make generalizations about the needs and issues in the earthquake-affected areas, let alone the differences among the demographic compositions, politics, level of harm, and divergent state response in the cities affected. The needs and tensions within a city or even a district are diverse. At the same time, one thing probably holds true for all the affected areas is that existing political and social tensions are fleshed out by the crisis. In Antep, such becomes evident in growing governmental and social anti-refugee policies and sentiments that I discussed, on top of deepening racial and class hierarchies. On top of this, I think specific to Antep is the excessive judicialization of politics and criminalization of notably Kurdish opponents over the years as a means to control this tri-border city, Antep, bordering not only Syria, but also Kurdish majority cities in Turkey. And how this over-criminalization proved its adverse effects on the mobilization of civil initiatives in the face of crisis. I believe this latter dimension kind of talks to all these debates about the absence of state accompanied by its strong presence, or state being nowhere, but at the same time everywhere in the earthquake affected areas. I believe many of us come together in the region in our indignation toward the state authorities for their failure in providing rescue and relief efforts. But at the same time, the undeniable absence of the state on the ground is strangely accompanied by its presence. And by presence here, I do not only refer to state efforts to confiscate the help collected by civil society initiatives or the current state of emergency declared following the earthquakes, but also and particularly to the direct outcomes of policies implemented over the 10+ years. As I mentioned, I experienced the 1999 earthquake as a 9-year-old child, and I remember receiving in the third day a Red Crescent provided tent. This did not happen this time. Even the rescue efforts did not reach many places by the third day. But what I also remember from the 1999 earthquake are a number of individual and civil society organizations running around and providing help in a coordinated manner. We see today similar initiatives, particularly in Antakya, or the help organized and provided from Diyarbakir to Adıyaman. Places I think can be example for Harun's statement on potentials for organizing. But in Antep, for instance, a coordination among the unions, local NGOs, chambers of different professions, and oppositional political parties could still not be established after 50 days from the earthquake. I refer by a coordination here to a simple one, at least to keep these different groups away from each other's actions and efforts concerning the earthquake. There have been such calls, for instance, from the Human Rights Association, inviting local organizations to a collective initiative. But the years of criminalization of civil initiatives by state authorities proved to be enough for making different organizations hesitant in participating in new political formations. Plus, the concerns over criminalization today following the state of emergency declared immediately after the earthquake is so deep that almost every institution tries to do something, remaining as invisible as possible to the state authorities. This being said, I sincerely doubt the state can actually really prevent local organizations to operate on the ground at this crisis moment anymore. It did start pretty assertively, trying to arrest truck drivers carrying goods or opening warehouses of local NGOs for police investigation. But problems are abandoned, and the state officials, at least for the moment in Antep, hardly seem to be on top of things in terms of like criminalizing the actions of civil society organizations. But of course, this is subject to change. But the current situation, at least, I think, attests to how the years of oppression and criminalization have effects so deep that turns inaction into best risk-free strategy until a structural political change is on the horizon. So in this lack of mobilization, inaction, or suspicion toward each other, I see the state presence that shaped our political culture over the last 10 plus years. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your discussion, and thank you so much for the pictures and providing us with visuals to see the reality of the affected areas. And with that, the first session of the panel comes to a close. I want to give about 20 minutes for audience questions, and the way we want to do questions is through the chat. So both on YouTube live stream and on Zoom, please, if you have any questions, send them in the chat. If your question is specific to a speaker, please indicate that also. So we can take any questions now. If you prefer to speak and ask, that is also okay. Yes, Brandy?
How are refugees in the US, or just victims of the disaster, not refugees in the sense the state uses the word, but how are these beautiful friends getting here? Are they able to get sanctuary?
Would anyone like to answer this question? Or is there need for clarification of the question? Could we get your question again, Brandy?
Or anywhere in the world, how in other places of the world, how are victims and survivors of the earthquake being accepted? Thank you.
I can speak to just to give an example. This hasn't changed, the earthquake hasn't changed anything in terms of the status of the well, they don't have the official state of refugee, the Syrians at least. This is the biggest part of the population of immigrants in Turkey. So we still have the agreement between the European Union and Turkey, that Turkey is a safe country, safe third country. Anyone that moves into the country is supposed to remain there, and Turkey gets billions and billions of dollars to keep the Syrian refugees who have a spatial status, transitory protection is called. They're here. This has nothing has changed in those terms. The help, earthquake relief help, comes on top of this. But I see those, like in the agreements in terms of the Syrian populations, the counterparts are very bureaucratic organizations. I was working in field hospitals. That was a prerequisite so that the Turkish state can get money from World Health Organization. It said, you will let the international field hospitals in if you want the relief money that comes from us. If this is perhaps the only concrete thing, the prerequisites that will move the money, that's why at least for a month and a half, people in the field, mostly in parts where hospitals are also destroyed physically, they had this help, it flew to the people who had this relief, who could come to the field hospitals. But otherwise, I fear that in terms of the international hierarchies about people's movement from the East to the West, be it the European Union or the United States, nothing has changed and nothing will change.
Thank you. There's also a link shared in the chat, I think, in response to the question. So thank you so much. Is there any other question? Okay, there's a question in the chat. My question is about the NGOization potential in the areas, and what are your thoughts about this? I can clarify maybe vocally. Idam, if you would like to speak, you're welcome to.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the talks. I'm also a survivor of the earthquake in '99, and also I'm trying to reformulate my research as a potential anthropologist, because my research is about Antioch, and now I have to do everything from the scratch. And so I have a lot of things in my mind, so forgive me if I cannot formulate my question well, but I've been thinking about the organization processes that all the speakers actually talked about, Aslı, Harun, and Hazal, all of them mentioned that. And so my previous research was in Palestine, and obviously it's a very different context. It's not an eco-political disaster, but it's another form of humanitarian crisis, which attracted a lot of both local and international NGOs in the region. And many people were concerned about the characteristics of these civil society organizations and their motivations in the region and how they operate. I'm saying this as a civil society worker myself, but in the disaster areas and the vulnerable areas, there's this, I don't know how to describe it well, but this attraction by a lot of institutions coming to the region, and they might operate without proper research about the indigenous culture or the maintenance of both the cultures of the people and also the physical areas, and it might pose a risk. And it's a question that I ask to myself personally, that how do we read this situation as both academics and activists who are trying to contribute to the repair of the areas, because it's a long process. It's obviously like it's going to take more than a decade, and especially Hazal also mentioned, like there's a very big mobility in Antioch right now that we don't see in other areas. So it's concerning me. It's, yeah, so I don't know if I clarified it well, but I'm curious about your thoughts about this, and how do we interpret this, or are there any ideas that we might consider going further or digging in deep, or are there any other institutions or concepts that we might explore in order to understand this a little bit better? So yeah, thank you.
Anyone who would like to take the question can go ahead.
Maybe I can just shortly share my observations to that effect, because Also, like following the war in Syria, like Antep has been like heaven for NGOs for a long time. Like there was this like NGOization of politics and daily life in general for the like particularly the experiences of refugees. And then following like 2016, like those NGOs started leaving for the security concerns, etc. But now like we are seeing actually a flow back to Antep, like with different NGOs, like initiating different programs and policies concerning the earthquake relief efforts. And I mean, I think one risk concerning this kind of NGOization is that, like, I mean, I'm talking to specific example of Antep once again, but given like how many local institutions are operating like to provide relief efforts while at the same time trying to remain as invisible as possible to state authorities, the like NGOs are taking the like most visible space in terms of the relief efforts, and this kind of turns like this kind of affects the political culture in the city as well, because then like all the relief efforts turn into like this logic of charity instead of like organizing in more like long-term, like a form of collective organization and politics. This being said, like under the current conditions, like it also gives some form of like, I mean, personally, I also experienced that, like if I am to try to enter as like visit a temporary sheltering area, I also would like try to work with local NGOs or like NGOs coming from abroad that have access to those regions, because there is also the securitization of like this temporary sheltering area. So it in a way like leaves all those like trying to like do contribute to certain relief work in these areas in a hard position. But I guess in the long run, it damages the political culture more than the good it does, because it really turns the structural political problem into question of charity and immediate humanitarian relief, whereas like there are much broader issues to be discussed about the current crisis.
I also would like to briefly reflect on this question. I think while we are thinking about NGOization in the quaked areas, we should also ask the question of which NGOs are we talking about. On the one hand, there are politically loyal NGOs, like let's say Beşiri Derneği, which is kind of an extension of the Menzil Tarikat, and they have been quite active in the earthquake zones. I have close friends who have been working in Adıyaman. They keep mentioning how they have been instrumental and also effective in distributing food to the earthquake victims. And on the other hand, we are talking, I think the government has been quite uneasy with what those NGOs who are considered to be as in the opposition or not politically loyal. They have been uneasy with their activities. And I think pace by pace, the government tries to get rid of these NGOs in opposition. And on the other hand, while replacing them with kind of pro-Islamic ones, in order to kind of not to lose the control over the kind of populations who still remained in the quake hit areas. Don't forget that like 2/3 of people in most areas have already left the quake hit areas, and they are in nearby cities mostly or in metropolis areas. The only most kind of populations who are vulnerable because of their kind of class positions, because of their kind of socioeconomic status, they still are in the region. And I think the government also considers this to cultivate more political dependencies, and also in a kind of neo-feudal way. I think that would be the best way to kind of conceptualize this, like the no distinctions between politics and economics and delivery of aid remains. That's why I think even, let's say, for example, what happened in Malatya in the previous week, an Islamic NGO kind of close to one of the Islamic parties, they have been prevented from delivering food, and people in Malatya, they reacted to this quite negatively, of course. but they are not politically loyal to the government. So I think the political loyalty seems to be the main criteria in the discussion about the NGOs in the region.
Thank you so much for your answers. Is there anything else anyone would like to add to this? If not, I believe we can take one more question and then we will end this session. So is there a last quick question? Yes, Burcu?
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for your very thought-provoking talk. So I have a question about the notion of crisis. There is some critique of the usage of the word crisis and urgency because it shifts our focus away from naming the actual capitalist networks as laying the grounds of this disaster. But I was wondering if in this case, did you observe this notion of urgency and crisis setting a basis for establishing new solidarity networks on the ground? Like, is it helpful in this case, this feeling of urgency for the people working on the ground? Or do you think it still like shifts us away from thinking about what brought us to this point?
If I have a few words, if nobody moves in, is it okay, Beyza?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Well, this is always the question when you're on the field, but I think this is such a dualism. So we can't help ourselves to feel this urgency and go there and be active in everyday efforts of relief. So I'm not a fan of anything that is relieving the pain, the structural pain we're going, but this is this has to go on. But it doesn't rules out the meaning of your question. But the stronger the civil society, I'm really taking, it's not the governmental NGOs, but the civil society, solidarity networks, the overexploited volunteers working on the field that move our life. I was in Hatay, but I'm sure it's not different in other provinces as well. So this is what keeps the life, despite the demographical engineering. This keeps the life alive. This is survival through those horizontal people, through the tired volunteers. They find a meaning, but also there are all moments of or utopic moments that how life could look like when not only in emergencies but in other situations when everything's down, how life can be reorganized, how waste should be disposed of, how our toilets should look like, how our food should be like. We're far away from those idyllic moments, but those are the discussions. Sometimes when I'm in Hatay, I feel this is sometimes the earthquake, the gizzy of the earthquake. We can't help being on the field with the sense that we are just relieving something where we can't help structurally. Everybody's certainly happy and depressed at the same time. Who's over there? So we can't say, so we shouldn't do this because it's shifting away the sight from the more general structural problems. I think it's looking the beast into the eyes in the local context. So that's why the question in itself doesn't have an answer. It is only stories to tell with. We should be active on different scales, on different time terms. Being aware of the problem that too much civil society takes away the responsibility, the accountability from a has to be social state. We have to you kind of make the state responsible, accountable on a political scale, on a provincial scale, on an institutional scale, the smaller, dictators and all the workspaces as well, but also be there because life wouldn't move there. There are children, there are people living there in their stands in front of their houses, there are animals, the life has to go on there, water has to be organized, toilets have to be organized. So we have to do all the things at the same time. But that's why only NGOization and the lack of coordination between NGOs is a threat, is an important problem we have to face again. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists who have given us very insightful talks, and thank you to everyone who asked questions. And with this, I will be closing the first session. The second session will reconvene at 1:45 p.m. New York City time. That would be, I cannot see right now what time that would be in Turkey, but that will be 8:45. Yes, thank you, 20:45. Thank you so much. And in the meantime, we will be playing a 20-minute video, so we encourage you to stay on Zoom or the live wherever you're watching this. So thank you so much again, and we will come back here in about half an hour.
Thank you.
February 6, 2023, a day for the people of Turkey to remember forever. 2 earthquakes hit the southeast of the country, one after the other, with the magnitudes of 7.8 and 7.6. They were not among the biggest earthquakes of the known human history, nor are they one of the longest ones, but they are certainly among the most destructive. They didn't have to be this destructive. These quakes have long been expected in this region. Multiple scientists warned the government and municipalities for them to take the necessary measures. None was taken. The result was a social disaster. 11 cities were immediately affected. The estimated number of the totally or nearly destroyed buildings is around 214,000. The officially declared death toll has exceeded 45,000, approaching to 50,000. The exact casualty is impossible to know because the Turkish government began to remove the rubble using construction machines without any regard of any possible danger to lives. These machines did not appear in the first 72 hours. The government did not mobilize any of its forces in this time. No military search and rescue teams and equipment were provided. No power generators or lighting. No tents, food and water supplies for survivors. Nothing. People were left with nothing during the most vital hours to save lives. Those who survived the quake were abandoned to the freezing cold temperatures. Some lives were lost because of hypothermia. Then AFAD, the Disaster and Emergency Management Presidency of the Ministry of Interior, sent insufficient numbers of trained rescue teams with insufficient equipment and tools to the field, to an area of disaster in which more than 13 million people live. People from the non-affected parts of the country immediately mobilized to send relief, aid and materials to the region. However, the government confiscated some of them during the first days. Despite all the challenges, people found some relief in each other through the community and already existing associations.
Depremin ilk gününden beri kadınlar birçok sıkıntıyla karşı karşıya kaldı. Bunlardan en başta olanı ise hijyen problemi. Birçok çadır kentte tuvalet, duş mevcut değil. İnsanlar tuvalet olarak üst geçitleri kullanmak zorunda kalıyorlar. Kadınlar hijyen malzemesi, pet, iç çamaşırı gibi ürünlere ulaşım sağlayamıyor. Kadınların en çok öne çıkan aslında bu hijyen problemine dair gözlemlediğimiz durumlardan biri de şuydu. Regl olan kadınlar hijyen malzemesine erişim sağlayamadığı için ağır hasarlı binalarına girmek zorunda kaldıklarını söylediler. Duş konusunda birçok problem mevcut. Hala duş alamıyorlar. Aynı zamanda içme suyuna da erişim sıkıntılı. Çocuklarına çeşmelerdeki suyu doldurup tencerelerde, kazanlarda kaynatıp içirmeye çalışıyorlar. İçme suyuna da erişim ciddi anlamda sıkıntılı. Depremin ilk günden bu yana birçok bölgede AFAD, Kızılay ve devlet yetkilileri mevcut değil. Kadınların ihtiyaçları ve talepleri görmezden gelinmekte. Siyasi partiler, dernekler ve sendikalar üzerinden ve halkın dayanışmasıyla aslında bu süreç ve ihtiyaçlar giderilmekte. Aynı zamanda Malatya'da kadınlar hayvancılık, tarım ve kayısı işiyle uğraşmakta. Birçok görüştüğümüz kadının kayısıları ve hayvanları göçük altında kalmış durumda. Göçük altından hayvanlarını çıkaran kadınlar ise hayvanlarını koruyabilecek bir alanları olmadığını, çadır dağıtımı yapılmadığını söylemekte. Birçok bölgeye çadır da ulaşmamış durumda. Tekstil işçisi kadınlar ise fabrikalarda işe çağrılmakta ve işe gelmeyenler için ise istifa etmelerini istemekte fabrika yönetimleri. Genel olarak Malatya'da durum böyle. Kadınlar açısından, çocuklar ve kadınlar açısından daha sıkıntılı bir süreç ilerliyor. Biz Ekmek ve Gül olarak ulaşabildiğimiz kadınlara ulaşmaya, dayanışmayı sürdürmeye devam ediyoruz.
The disaster management plan of the government was not human-centered but profit-driven, as were employers' approaches. They even dared to call workers hit by the quake back to production in the first week.
Merhabalar. 6 Şubat sabahı büyük bir deprem felaketiyle uyandık. Ve dışarı can havliyle kendimizi dışarı attığımızda -10 derece bir soğuk ve üzerimize yağan sulu bir kar mevcuttu. İnsanlar yarı çıplak halde kendilerini can havliyle dışarı atarken, parklarda, çatıların altında korunmaya çalışırken aynı zamanda da yardımın gelmesini bekliyordu. Saatler geçtikçe yardım gelmediği gibi ihtiyaçlar da can yakıcı bir şekilde baş göstermeye başladı. İlk başlardaki ihtiyaç barınabilecekleri bir çadır, ısınabilecekleri bir battaniye, içebilecekleri bir su ve gidebilecekleri bir tuvaletti. Kadınların, çocukların, yaşlıların acil bir şekilde bu ihtiyaçlara ulaşmaları gerekiyordu. Biz de Bir Tek Sen Sendikası olarak hemen organize olup bir kriz masası oluşturduk ve Nar Sanat Derneği ile beraber insanlara ihtiyaç duydukları yardım malzemelerini ulaştırmaya çalıştık. Biz bunu yaparken bunun bir de sermaye tarafı vardı, işveren tarafı vardı, fabrikalar hasar görmüştü. İnsanlar damları olmadığı bir halde yakınlarını bırakıp, ailelerini bırakıp işlere gitmek istemediler. Biz de sendika olarak çağrımızı bu şekil yaptık. İşçilere işe gitmeme çağrısı yaptık. Bunları işçi duraklarında yaptık. İşçilerin yoğunluklu yaşadığı semtlerde yaptık. Fabrika önlerinde yaptık. Fakat biz bunu yaparken Malatya'da Milmay Tekstil işvereni, Şantuk Tekstil işvereni, Baykandenim işvereni tüm çağrılarımıza rağmen güvencesiz ortamda işçi arkadaşlarımızı çalışmaya zorladılar. Çalışmak istemeyenleri de işten atmakla tehdit edip hatta sarsıntı anında dışarı çıkmak isteyen kadın işçilerin üstüne kapı kilitleyerek dışarıya çıkmalarını engellediler. Hakeza Maraş'ta bir metal fabrikası hasarlı binasından malzeme çıkartmaya çalışırken 6.4'lük bir deprem oldu ve bir işçi kardeşimiz enkaz altında kalarak öldü. 4 işçi kardeşimiz de yaralı olarak çıkartıldı.
The Turkish government's anti-women policies of ordinary times worsened in such a disastrous situation. All the patriarchal roles intensified by the one-man rule in the country for the last 20 years directly threatened women's lives following the quake. Many women were caught by the second quake when they walked in the houses damaged by the first hit in order to collect food and kitchen utensils as well as clothing, especially for their children. The absence of urgent aid by the government cost them their lives.
Yurt dışında yaşayan tüm kız kardeşlerimize, bu dayanışmayı örgütleyen herkese Antep'ten selamlar. Ben Antep Nar Bilim Kültür ve Sanat Derneği Başkanı Merve Karataş. 6 Şubat ve sonrasında yaşadığımız depremlerin etkisi hala devam ediyor ve uzunca bir süre devam edeceği benziyor. On binlerce insanımızı kaybettik, yüz binlerce insan yaralandı, evsiz kaldı. Depremin ilk anından itibaren enkaz altında kalanlar bambaşka sorunlarla, kendini kurtarabilenler, sokağa atanlar da başkaca sorunlarla karşı karşıya kaldı. Depremin karlı bir havaya denk gelmesi sebebiyle insanlar soğukla da mücadele etmeye çalıştı. Fakat ilk andan bu yana iktidar ve felaket anında hazır bulunması gereken aygıtlar ortada yoktu. Hala da birçok yerde yoklar. Depremin 25. gününü geride bıraktık. Fakat hala yardım ulaşamayan binlerce yer var, 10 binlerce insan var. Biz depremin hemen ardından gelebilen herkesle derneğin binasına geldik ve biz de depremzedeydik, tedirgindik, içimizi bir korku kaplamıştı. Yaşadığımız çok kısa bir süre içerisinde atlatıp ne yapabiliriz diye düşündük. Bunun üzerine kafa yorduk. Ardından Nar Sanat olarak Bir Tek Sen, Ekmek ve Gül ve Emek Partisi ile hızlıca bir koordinasyon oluşturduk. İlk günler binlerce kişiye yemekler ulaştırmaya çalıştık ve sonrasında bu işin sadece bir başımıza yapamayacağımızı farkına vardık ve destek ve dayanışma hattı kurduk. Çünkü yardıma ihtiyacı olan on binlerce insan, yüz binlerce insan vardı. Dayanışma hattı sayesinde buraya birçok yardım malzemesi ulaştı ve aklınıza gelebilecek her türlü malzemeyi yardım çağrısının geldiği her noktaya planlı ve sistematik bir biçimde ulaştırdık. Bizim bu süreçte hem dayanışma ağımız büyüdü hem de ekibimiz büyüdü. Fakat temin edebildiğimiz malzemeleri sahaya ulaştırırken gözümüze çarpan pek çok sorunla karşılaştık. Bu ulaşamayan yardımları biraz açmak gerekirse aslında hala temiz suya ulaşamayan yerler var. Binaların patlayan sularını toplayıp, kaynatıp temiz suyu öyle halletmeye çalışan kadınlar var, insanlar var. Hala çocuklara bez bulmakta zorlanan insanlar var. Çadırı olmayan insanlar var. Belki biliyorsunuzdur, Antep'te bir süre önce, bu Hatay'da yaşanan son deprem, 6.4'lük depremden birkaç gün önce çadırlar toplatılmıştı. Evleriniz güvenli, evlere gidebilirsiniz ya da yurtlara gidin denilmişti. Halbuki evler ya ağır hasarlıydı ya da yıkılmıştı. İnsanlar evlerin önünden de ayrılmak istemiyordu ve çadırlar kaldırıldığı için bir kısmı sokakta kaldı, bir kısmı da evlerine dönmek zorunda kaldı. Fakat bu çadırlar toplatıldıktan birkaç gün sonra da yeni bir depremle karşı karşıya kaldığımızda, yani ikinci bir kaosa sürüklendik Antep'te. Çünkü insanlar sokakta, çadırlar yok. İnsanlar soğukla, açlıkla baş etmeye çalışıyor. Hala temiz suya erişemeyen yerler var. Binaların patlayan sularından su ihtiyacını karşılamaya çalışan yerler var. Hala duş alamayan, bir ayı geçtik ve hala duş alamayan insanlar var. Bu sebeple salgın hastalıklar da baş göstermeye başladı. Uyuz, bit gibi hastalıklar. Aynı zamanda kadınlar için de hijyen malzemelerine ulaşamadıkları için vajinal hastalıklar, kadınsal hastalıklar baş göstermeye başladı. Yine tıbbi ilaçlara da ulaşmak çok zor bu süreçte. Depremden en çok etkilenen kesimlerden birisi de kadınlardı. Onlar da depremzede olmasına rağmen sanki normal yaşamlarına devam ediyormuş gibi tüm iş yüklerini yine kendi üstlerine aldılar. Çünkü bu şekilde dayatıldı. Yakacak bulma, temizlik sorunu, yemek yapma, çocuklara bakma hepsi kadınların üzerineydi. Kadınlar burada yas tutmaya dahi fırsat bulamadılar. Yardım istediklerinde bile önce çocuklarına, eşlerine istediler ve kendi ihtiyaçlarını çok önemsemediler. Üstelik pet, iç çamaşırı gibi acil ihtiyaçları dahi söylemeye çekiniyorlardı. Yanımıza gelip kulağımıza fısıldayarak bunu da verebilir misiniz diyorlardı. Ve kadınlara olabildiğince bu destekleri özellikle ulaştırmaya çalıştık. Bunu söyleyemediklerinin farkındaydık. Depremin ilk saatlerinden bugüne Antep'te patronlar işçileri işe çağırmaya başladı. Ve kadınlar eşleri yanında olmayınca çok daha tedirgin oluyorlardı. Bunun sebebi de gerçekten güvensiz bir ortamdayız. Özellikle ilk hafta bölgede, sadece Antep'te de değil, büyük bir kaos hakimdi. Tehlikenin nereden geleceği hiç belli değildi. Ve çocukların ya da kadınlar kendilerinin başına bir şey gelmesinden korkuyordu. Özellikle bölgede binlerce çocuğun hala bulunamaması, kayıp olarak geçmesi kadınları daha da tedirgin hale sokuyordu. Ve biz bu süreçte hem bu korkunun hakim olduğu hem bu sıkıntıların baş gösterdiği yerde kadınlardan hep şu cümleyi duyduk: keşke ölseydik de bu sıkıntıları yaşamasaydık. Bizce çok acı ve depremin gerçekten tam olarak, deprem sonrasını tam olarak yansıtan bir cümle kadınlar açısından. Bir diğer öne çıkan mesele ise mültecilerin ve abdalların dışlanmasıydı. Bu gruplar sadece Antep'te değil, bölgede de yağmacılıkla suçlanıyordu ve bu süreçte dayanışmanın daha da büyümesi gereken yerde, desteklerin ulaşması gereken yerde mülteci düşmanlığı kışkırtılmaya çalışılıyordu. Biraz da bunun sebebi öfkeyi başka noktaya çekmekti. Çünkü aslında insanlar neden enkaz altında kaldığımızı ya da deprem sonrasında yardımların ihtiyaçlarına ulaşmamasının asıl sebebini biliyordu. Fakat buradaki öfkeyi biraz daha bastırmak için mülteci düşmanlığı körüklenmeye başladı. Ki bakıldığında yine aptallar ve mülteciler yardımın en az ulaştığı ya da hiç ulaşmadığı gruplardı. Ve şöyle bir şey de var, yani depremden önce de aslında bu insanların yaşamı çok kötü durumdaydı. Yoksul insanlardı ve Antep'in en kötü yerlerinde, kimsenin oturmak istemediği yerlerde yaşıyorlardı. Oysa ki biz bu mülteci düşmanlığının karşısında burada oluşturduğumuz ekiplerle sadece yerel arkadaşlarla değil, yerel insanlarla değil, aynı zamanda mülteci arkadaşlarımızla beraber bu ekibi oluşturduk ve hep birlikte bu kolileri birlikte bantladık. Kolileri yardıma olan yerlere, yardıma ihtiyacı olan yerlere hep birlikte ulaştırdık. Yine bahsetmek istediğim noktalardan birisi aslında çocuklar. Kuşkusuz depremden en çok etkilenen kesim çocuklar ve onlara küçücük yaşta onlar büyük korkularla savaşmaya çalışıyor. Burada depremden etkilenen herkesin aslında psikososyal bir desteğe ihtiyacı var ve biz de çocuklardan başlayarak bir şeyler yapma kararı aldık. Bakırköy Ekmek ve Gül'den kadın arkadaşlarımız Kız Kardeşlik Köprüsü'nün karşılık bulduğu çağrıyla bize Antep'te yaşayan depremzede çocuklara gökyüzü çadırı, oyuncaklar, malzemeler ulaştırdı. Ve biz de derneğin içerisinde çadırı kurduk ve çocukları çağırdık. Çoğu bulunduğumuz mahallede oturuyordu ve derneğin bulunduğu alan da yine %70'inin mültecilerin oluşturduğu bir mahalle. Uzman gönüllülere hemen bir çağrı yaptık. Çocuklarla uzman bir şekilde, profesyonel bir şekilde ilgilenebilecek insanlara ve çocuklara psikososyal destek sağlayıp güvenli oyun alanları yarattık. Birlikte şarkılar söyledik, resimler çizdik, bazen oyun oynadık, Arapça masallar dinledik, bazen de dans ettik. Açıkçası biz burada çocuklarla bir bakıma yaralarımızı sardık, çok eğlendik ve bu çocuk etkinliğimize de uzunca bir süre devam etmeyi düşünüyoruz. Aynı zamanda kadınlarla birlikte onlara psikososyal destek sağlamak amacıyla çalışma yürütmeyi düşünüyoruz önümüzdeki günlerde.
The affected region is also a host to many migrant and refugee women, especially those from Syria. The government's forces literally ignored their existence and needs, leaving them completely to their own fate. It is documented that some officials forced a group of migrants, mostly women and children, onto a bus, destination of which is still unknown to us. We heard in some cases that Syrian women did not make a sound because they assumed they would not be saved from the rubble if they spoke Arabic. They are exposed to racist and anti-migrant provocations. We work hard to support the solidarity between local and migrant women.
Biliyoruz.
Biz akşam yemek getirmeye gittik. İşte dediler akşam da çıkmayın. Dedi siz hırsız yapıyorsun dedi.
Kim dedi bunları?
Devlet burada söylüyorlar, polisler söylüyorlar. İşte dedi çıkmayın dedi. Eğer çıkarsınız akşam dedi. Yani biz vurabiliriz yani.
Polis sizi vurmakla mı tehdit ediyor?
Evet, tehdit ettiler bize. O zaman da biz çıkmadık. Yani dedi niye çıkıyoruz? Burada bir spor salonunda yemek yapıyorlar. Yemek veriyorlar. İşte biz gitmek için de yaptık dedi. Hayır çıkmayın akşam dedi. Yemek için getirmeyin.
Yemek bile alamıyorsunuz. İzin vermiyorlar.
Evet alamıyor.
Yani.
İzin vermiyor çünkü dedi eğer çıkarsın dedi çok zararlı olacak dedi.
One of the most urgent needs of the surviving women in the affected areas were hygiene pads, tampons, underwear and other such needs of the female body. Those items could not and still cannot find a place in the government's lists. In the face of such serious problems and needs, Ekmek ve Gül quickly mobilized in its women's network and immediately formed a coalition among women's organizations and its local groups. And we make a call on all women in the country to join our campaign. We rebuild the life through sisterhood bridges. Our reader groups got to work.
Merhabalar, ben Kayseri Ekmek ve Gül Kadın grubundan Sevil. Kız Kardeşlik Köprüsü'yle Yaşamı Yeniden Kuruyoruz kampanyası üzerinden biz hijyen kitleri hazırlıyoruz. Hazırladığımız her bir kitin içinde pet, iç çamaşırı, ıslak mendil, kağıt mendil, kolonya, tarak, tırnak makası, el kremi bulunuyor.
Many women's organizations also gave answer to our call.
Merhabalar, burası Esenyalı Kadın Dayanışma Derneği. Derneğimiz 9 yıldır kadınlar içerisinde faaliyet yürütüyor. Bugün de bir deprem felaketiyle karşı karşıya kaldık. Depremde zarar gören kız kardeşlerimizin yaralarını hep birlikte sarmaya çalışıyoruz. Bölgeye bir tır kadar yardım gönderdik. Şimdi de Ekmek ve Gül'ün başlattığı Kız Kardeşlik Köprüsü'yle Hayatlarımızı Yeniden Kuruyoruz kampanyasına biz de Esenyalı'dan yanıt verdik. Bölgede doğum yapacak yüzlerce kadının çocukları için, yeni doğacak bebekleri için yeni doğan paketleri hazırlıyoruz. Bu paketleri hazırlarken de yine kadınlar ellerinde avuçlarında ne varsa bir araya getirip bize kendilerinden katkılar sunuyorlar. Bu açıdan bölge halkının, bölgede yaşayan kadınların sorunlarının da daha giderek derinleşeceğini bilerek buradan herkese destek çağrısında da bulunmak istiyoruz.
Ekmek ve Gül volunteers did not lose any time in arriving on the ground and organized the work for women's needs. Dear sisters all around the world, there is still too much work to do. Ekmek ve Gül tries to spread women's solidarity everywhere. We do our best to spot the adequate needs on the ground, organize the necessary support, and make sure that it is delivered to our sisters. Meanwhile, we report all of these violations, put pressure on government bodies to fulfill their duties, and make sure that the government's sexist attitude is known everywhere we can reach. Now we call on all women around the world. It's time to strengthen women's international solidarity.
Şahika sesin gelmiyor.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, perfect. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second and final session of the February 6 Earthquakes, Survival, Disaster, Capitalism, and Right to Shelter. My name is Shaika. I'm a member of New York Earthquake Solidarity. We have 4 speakers today: Fulya Ali Koç, Mehmet Türkmen, Mustafa Shala from Turkey, and Holden Taylor from New York. Sia Weaver, campaign coordinator of Housing Justice for All, unfortunately couldn't make it today. She has an emergency at work and sent her wishes to everyone. So similar to first session, each speaker will have a 15-minute presentation, and we will have 30 minutes for the Q&A session. You can write your questions or comments into the chat box if you're watching us over Zoom, and I want to encourage you to use live chat feature if you're watching us on YouTube. Please feel free to follow up with our panelists afterwards. In this session, we wanted to bring together our comrades who are in the anti-capitalist struggle, and also we want to discuss more about the consequences of the disaster capitalism and poor and unsafe housing conditions in the earthquake-affected regions, also in the US. As already mentioned earlier in the first session today, over 200,000 buildings were destroyed or severely damaged according to the government figures. Safety codes were ignored in the construction of homes and apartments, placing the profit of private companies above human safety in Turkey and Syria. So in the United States, we see a similar situation in which landlords force poor and working class people to live in unsafe conditions, such as in New Orleans, Flint, Michigan, and here in New York. Our speakers will provide their experiences from the field and thoughts on this crisis and a global struggle. And before we delve into discussion with our first speaker, Holden, I want to make a final announcement. Our comrades Mustafa Şala and Mehmet Türkmen will make their speech in Turkish. You will hear an English translation on YouTube streamline. If you want to listen to them in Turkish, please feel free to join our Zoom link and stay in the Turkish channel. You just need to click on the globe icon and select the Turkish language. And I want to introduce our first speaker, Holden Taylor. Holden is an organizer with Brooklyn Eviction Defense and then adjunct teacher in the CUNY system. They're a member of the Marxist Unity Group, and then they're a PhD candidate at CUNY's Graduate Center, where they study housing, tenancy, and political economy. Their presentation will focus on the current housing crisis in the US. Floor is yours, Holden. Please begin when you're ready and unmute yourself.
Excuse me for the interruption, Holden. Can I ask a quick clarifying question about the translations before we begin?
Sure.
We have two translators and a third, additional translator ready at hand now. Just to clarify, are we translating just the Turkish speakers?
Yeah.
Okay.
From Turkish to English.
And now the English presentations, you don't want us to translate the Turkish for them?
No.
Okay, just a minute.
Dilruba will make a summary in Turkish and then send it to them.
All
to them. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emre.
Okay, thank you. So when my comrade Akim asked me to take part in this panel, at first I was very hesitant, unsure of my place or what I could possibly contribute. I've never been to Turkey and I'm not entirely familiar with the political, cultural, or historical landscape. I'm really just a tenant organizer here in the States. But after talking with my comrade Akim for a while and through him beginning to recognize the role of real estate capital in the devastation of this earthquake, how real estate capital both set the conditions for the horrific human cost of this disaster and parasitically undermined many subsequent relief efforts, capitalizing not just on disaster, but as disaster, I began to see a lot of familiar patterns. I'm a member of and I organize with Brooklyn Eviction Defense, and we are a principled communist, independent, working class tenant union and organization. Next Saturday at noon in Brooklyn at 828 Midwood Street, in what is appropriately the intersection of Flatbush, Crown Heights, Prospect, Lefferts Garden, and also East New York, we're hosting an action with and led by a leader of a large tenant association of a large multi-building Mitchell-Lama co-op complex. The action is most simply a rallying call against the wave of evictions that have hit these neighborhoods and this building complex particularly in the last decade and since the pandemic instituted eviction moratorium here was let expire in January of 2022. There are currently 155,000 active eviction cases in New York City. These 4 neighborhoods have among the highest rates of eviction and dispossession across the 5 boroughs. One of the people evicted from this particular building complex was a young man named King Judah, forcibly removed from his home in a holdover case in February of 2020, right before the pandemic began. Not long after being evicted, King was found passed away, with the cause of his death listed as hypothermia. He had been living on the street since the violent dispossession. He is lived on by his grandmother, who still lives in the building complex on Midwood Street. The leader of this tenant association, Leslie, is holding the rally in his memory. King Judah was murdered, let me be clear, by the Harry Silver Company Board of Directors, its leader, Unella Roan Perry, and by Linda Burton, landlord lawyer at Burton & Burton, who legally executed the eviction. He was murdered by the Marion Scott Inc. real estate company that manages the property. He was murdered, moreover, by the entire complex of institutions and coalitions that compose the real estate state. This includes the Kangaroo Courts of 141 Livingston, also called Housing Court, where 6 of the 8 courtrooms are dedicated to fast-tracking evictions. This includes also the shill landlord lawyers who fill those halls, the bloated carceral apparatus, including both the four higher marshals who forcibly execute evictions, and the whole New York Police Department who back up marshals when facing any possible resistance. This includes, too, the real estate lobbies, barons, and their pet politicians, the underwriting banks, and, increasingly, multinational financial firms. The web of guilt here extends across the globe. The real estate and the financial firms, the asset managers, the hedge funds implicated in King Judah's murder are functionally indistinguishable from those that have profited off of and created so many of the conditions for the devastating and incomprehensible tragedy of February 6th. This is, despite the vast geographic separation and the manifold historical and cultural distinctions and variations, truly one international struggle. This is always a singular struggle over a singular world system. The worker tenants, the people, the colonized, the oppressed, and the exploited stand on one side, and on the other stands capital in all its grotesque forms. I want to highlight 3 tenets of Brooklyn eviction defense that come directly from our organizational points of unity and that are imbued through conscious critique into every aspect of our work. The first is that working class tenants are our historical protagonists. This means that the worker tenant, e.g., he who does not control his own housing or habitation, and does not control that of anyone else, is our historical arbiter, is a world historical actor whose leadership we as an organization follow, and from whose power the resolutions to both our immediate pressing concerns and the wider, more fundamental, violent contradictions will spring. We are not a nonprofit and do not have a board nor funders. We are accountable as worker tenants only to worker tenants. The second is that our horizons as an organization are first working class control over where and how we live, and then the abolition of evictions, rent, and private property. And the world in which these latter conditions are possible is classless and free of oppression, communism. We understand both the grander project that our work must attend to and the pressing material needs that are foisted upon worker tenants by the dominance of real estate capital. The third is that we are independent, working class, and democratic. We are not funded by the city or philanthropic donors. We are, again, accountable only to working class tenants, to organized tenants across the borough. These 3 principles are important because of what they mean we are not. The housing complex that King Judah was evicted from, that we are helping now organize and bring into our tenant union, and at which we are helping host this rally coming up on Saturday, this complex is a Mitchell-Lama co-op. Mitchell-Lama was an affordable housing program enacted in New York State in 1955. It was meant for middle-income residents. The program entailed eminent domain seizures of property deemed undesirable, which is also known as slum clearance, by local jurisdictions that were then given to developers on the condition that they developed for low and middle-income tenants. These developers then retained and still retain tax abatements and low-interest mortgages, subsidized by some combination of city, state, and federal taxes, as long as they maintain that specified affordability. 828 is a cooperative run by a board of directors. Around the year 2000, the board of directors went rogue. There have been numerous complaints of mismanaged funds. A $3 million loan was taken out and this money is still not accounted for. The building abandoned its affordable housing pledge, lost its Mitchell-Lama designation, and subsequently lost its tax exemption status. In 2015, the cooperative, facing bankruptcy, hired Marion Scott Real Estate Incorporated to manage the property. This for-profit company specializes in managing affordable housing, which, in other words, means that they have, through their tremendous entrepreneurial spirit, managed to exploit policies and legislation meant to help working-class tenants stay in their homes for over 3 decades now. There are 294 units across the 3 buildings in the co-op on Midwood Street. Since 2017, the 3-building complex has seen 280 eviction filings. This is to say that even the most well-meaning legislative programs, those meant to ensure tenant safety and safe housing under the aegis of the real estate state that we live in, and more broadly within the capitalist world system, these are always susceptible to predatory capital and are only ever as strong, effective, or meaningful as the working class organization that enforces them to be. When I read about Erzurum being the lone city in Turkey's earthquake region to remain unscathed through the earthquake only for the reason that it, unlike so many of the cities devastated, actually and uniformly enforced legislated building regulations, I immediately recognized this pattern. This is the same phenomenon. Every inch of welfare is only more common ground to be enclosed upon, unless we are organized and prepared to defend that ground. Moreover, those well-meaning institutions that explicitly replicate capitalist structures of dominance in their organization and function, all while professing to serve or defend the working class, the nonprofit landlords that regularly evict tenants, and the housing co-op boards of directors safe from democratic accountability, like that at 828 Midwood. These are especially vulnerable to capitalist predation, that is, if we are to say not reactionary in and of themselves. Which brings me back to bed in our principles and our programs. We are currently building a tenant union across the borough, one imbued with and informed by those points articulated before: independence, democratic organization, working class protagonism, communism. We have aims, along with our comrades and other independent working class tenant unions across the city, to cohere into a citywide tenant union. We are not the first people to endeavor on this course of action. New York City has a rich history of radical tenant organization from which we can and really must learn. My own study of this history shows me that we have, as an independent tenant union, only two paths to actual long-term sustainability in front of us. The first path is that all of us organizers choose our own self-interests and we professionalize. This means we prioritize the survival of our organization, or even more selfishly, our careers, over the broader actual movement, which means over the actual worker tenants of the city. To do this, either our organization incorporates or we organizers get jobs that cause many of the boundaries between our independent organization and the nearby nonprofits to blur. Many of the current housing nonprofits in New York City, like Met Council on Housing, Los Suros, Fifth Avenue, are examples of the former. Some of these retain their radical rhetoric, others have abandoned it totally. Some have become full-on landlords, others just service-oriented nonprofits. This path, as should be no surprise, conflicts fundamentally with our organizational program. On this path, worker tenants are not protagonists, but clients, or worse, dependents. On this path, our organization is neither democratic nor independent. On this path, our union would play no part in the world historical pursuit of communism. The second path is to merge with the socialist movement and for us to become participants in the construction of a socialist New York City and a socialist world. And this, of course, for our organization is the only choice. This merger is a dialectical necessity. For one, the tenant movement's organized foe has already completed a merger of its own. Finance capital and real estate capital are inseparable spheres. More, the socialist movement provides our union and the tenant movement with new political possibilities, which means new tools and weapons to confront landlordism and real estate and capital writ large, which means more ability to actualize the horizon of working class control over how and where we live. More, it is only through socialism that the tenant movement can begin to actualize the sort of international solidarity necessary to confront the global real estate state and to engage in the singular world struggle. The tenant movement offers to the socialist movement here actual bases of power with actual roots, not mobilized voters, but actual working class organizations practicing democratic politics, and the good kind of democratic politics, at the level of the building, the block, the neighborhood. This is actual practical democracy. Socialism does not come from above, from policy, but must be produced at the ground level, at people's work and in people's homes. I'll end my short talk by quoting Walter Rodney, the late revolutionary, whose birthday was just a few days ago. This is coming from his series of essays on the Russian Revolution. For anyone brought up to accept voting in constituencies and for several parties as the only form of democracy, it is often difficult to understand that there are alternatives and superior alternatives. Lenin recognized that bourgeois parliamentary democracy was an advance over feudalism, but that it was also a system in which the worker was reduced to choosing his oppressors once every 4 or 5 years. Against this, Lenin projected proletarian democracy, where the government would be in the hands of workers chosen by other workers at their place of work. We can expand Rodney's analysis to call for proletarian democracy, where our structures of government are in hands of worker tenants chosen by other worker tenants at both their place of work and in their neighborhoods and on their block. Thank you so much for having me, and deep solidarity with all, particularly with the working people of Turkey.
Thank you very much for your contribution, Holden. Can you hear me? You hear me well? Okay, great. I just want to make sure that everyone can hear me. Okay. So now I want to introduce our second speaker, Fulya Alikoç. She's a correspondent of Ekmek ve Gül daily website. Ekmek ve Gül means bread and rose in Turkish, and named after the historic struggle of women workers at the beginning of the 20th century. I assume all of you know about this history. So they launched a campaign under the slogan, "We rebuild life through the bridges of sisterhood and spot the adequate needs in the field." And they organized the necessary support in the earthquake-affected areas. Today, she will give us some clues about the everyday misogyny of the Turkish government, the one-man rule on the ground, and Ekmek ve Gül's response to this misogynist one-man rule. We are so happy to have you here, Fulya. Please start when you are ready, and I think you can share your slides now.
Okay, does anyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Sharing. Let me take it. Oh. So I think you can see the screen, right?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Okay. Hi, everyone. First of all, I would like to say how sad we are for those we lost in the earthquakes of Turkey and Syria. And I also want to thank you for organizing this event. It means a lot for people in Turkey, women in particular. My name is Fulya Alikoç, as announced. I'm a member of the editorial board of Ekmek ve Gül. For those who are not familiar with who we are, I made a really good summary. So, embrace the working class women's heritage and legacy, obviously. And we're actually a nationwide women's network in Turkey, organized around a monthly journal, Women's Magazine, and a daily-based working website. And we also publish a weekly page in the daily printed newspaper, Evrensel, on every Sunday. So Evrensel is a working class newspaper. In our network, there are 7 women's organizations, associations in different parts of the country. And we have local Ekmek ve Gül reading groups in 22 different cities, and many university groups and student clubs. Basically, this is the network. This was a network of solidarity we mobilized immediately after the earthquakes, and it's growing since we made a call for the campaign. We rebuilt the life through sisterhood bridges. So you can see our logo, and this is the last issue's cover. So I would like to summarize women's post-quake situation in Turkey in several points and questions I imagine you might have, friends abroad, actually. So the first question or first point might be like, why and how an act of nature became a social disaster for people in general and women in particular. And secondly, I want to give you some clues about how everyday misogyny of the Turkish government one-man rule, as we call it since a while, worked on the ground. And the third, how women responded to it, how we organize solidarity. So let's start with the first one. Why and how an act of nature became a social disaster for people in general. So that's a relevant question because the quakes were not listed among the biggest quakes in the known human history, as you might know, very well know. The magnitudes were 7.8 and 7.6 after all, and not even close to a magnitude of 9. So they're not particularly so destructive. They shouldn't be. But the damage they caused was among the biggest. So we are approaching to the second month of these days, and the official death toll is approximately 51,000, and it is impossible to know the exact number, but we can say that it's a lot more than this. Then we do the math. The 11 cities were immediately affected, and it's an area populated by more than 13 million people, 16 million according to UN Population Fund Agency. So again, officially, the President Erdogan announced 230,000 buildings were to be totally or nearly destroyed or heavily damaged. So why all this destruction? It's actually an inevitable consequence of 20-year-old policies of the Turkish government. Justice and Development Party and President Erdogan adopted a strategy of economic growth based on non-productive capital accumulation. I'd like to draw attention to on two main things, actually. One is cheap labor to invite foreign capital and investments. And the second is supporting construction industry in the country. Erdogan government, or the one-man rule as we call it now, signed numbers of public contracts with business circles, some his relatives, some that came to be known as Islamist or conservative or green capital, as we call it in Turkey, including construction companies. So there was this Islamist and nepotism working on as well. So to ensure their profits, the government dried up rivers, lakes, agricultural lands, and many small-scale agricultural producers faced poverty and being forced to move to the cities as cheap labor force, obviously, while construction companies raised their buildings on these grounds, which were not suitable for construction, and the result became catastrophic, as we have been witnessing for the last 2 months. So another point is how government achieved to turn this natural event to a social disaster is about the search and rescue operation as well as the post-quake disaster management, which were profit-driven, not human-centered. So there are thousands of construction machines in the country, and none of them appeared during the first 72 hours underground. So who has the possession of the means of production is important here. So on the third day, for example, for another example of this point, on the third day, the Red Cross sold 2,050 tents to a charity. So it was a trade, it was a business contract between a charity and an official body. While people were waiting for rescue in the freezing cold. So then it turns out that the AFAD, the Interior Ministry's Disaster Management Presidency, one officially entitled body to run the search and rescue work, have been human sourced from the religious affairs and Islamic communities, so not eligible for the job. Erdogan immediately declared a state of emergency under the pretext of maintaining security. He did not use his power to suspend stock exchange, for example, so allowing big companies to make profit over the quake. When the rescue machines appeared on the ground, people who have been screaming for rescue teams to save their loved ones from the rubble had to witness the teams saving ATM machines of the banks. So just like the government, the employers in the region were also more concerned about their profits. They called workers who lost their relatives, homes, whatever they have, to come back to factories, to production. So Mehmet here, the president of the United Textile Workers, an active union in the region, will provide you with sufficient account of these callings, let's say, much more than I can ever do. But let me, here I limit myself to say, pregnant women workers were called to the production on the second day. So the government did nothing about them either. So let's skip the second question. Why and how an act of nature became a social disaster for women, especially, or what women experienced during and after the quakes, in other words. So 3 related points become prominent, I guess. First, all the misogynist, anti-women, sexist policies that Justice and Development Party governments over the last 20 years put into action, like exploiting women as cheap labor, confining women to the walls of family, burdening all the housework and care work on their shoulders, making the right to divorce to be enjoyed by women harder than ever. So trying to abolish women's rights to allowance in case of divorce. So trying to abolish our right to abortion, decreasing the sexual and marriage consent age to 12, justifying abuse of children by marriage, or some of you might probably know, the President annulled Istanbul Convention, and now our national code against gender-based violence is under attack in the course of general elections. So all these turned into a catastrophe for women and children during this process. So secondly, the state sexism was at work when it comes to the distribution of the relief and aid on the ground. There was no gender equality in right to survive either. So the third point is, like, as it's well known, Turkey is a conventional transit country for immigrants from Africa and Asia to Europe. Recently, it's turned into a compulsory destination country because of the agreements between European countries and President Erdogan, who abuses them. Who abuses refugees, migrant population as a demographic weapon, actually. So migrant and refugee women have been living through a hell with all these quakes. So specifically, Holy Family collapsed on women. Imagine yourself standing by the rubble once you call home, in the freezing cold, in the utter absolute darkness, hearing the voices under the wreckage, calling for help, and in fear of death and losing your loved ones. You would naturally wait for help, but so did our sisters in the region. Hours passed and no military forces, no rescue teams came. No clothes, no food, and no water. When the daylight came, many women walked into the damaged buildings to get some food for their families, while men went seeking something to get warm. Then the second quake hit. Those women who were caught in the damaged houses, so many women still have to walk into those buildings to fulfill their patriarchal household duties. Women are collecting water from the broken plumbing systems, boil them to get clean water, so satisfy their children's thirst. Household work multiplied and took much more primitive forms during this process. So state sexism. Again, imagine yourself in such a situation. having your period. This conservative government did not put hygiene pads, tampons, and such items in their lists. We made a call on AFAD to update its lists by including the needs of female human body, actually. They still did not do this. Such sexism was at work on the ground operations in such a situation where women need more female staff to communicate. AFAD did not allow them to be part of post-quake work because they're women, quote unquote. Or it refused giving tents to women because they're not family, again, quote unquote. So we reported all these violations. This attitude makes sense, actually, when you consider the 20-year-old policy that women are valuable as long as they're part of a family. All in all, we heard from the first hand that when Erdogan said a few years ago, a woman is not complete if she is not a mother. So now imagine yourself being pregnant in the middle of this nightmare. Many women gave birth to their babies under the wreckage, under the collapsed buildings. Only few survived. And those who were survived were announced as miracles in the bourgeois media. According to UN Population Fund, again, there were like 226,000 pregnant women living in the affected region, and approximately 24,000 of them were expected to deliver their babies within a month. So now my friend Mehmet's wife here being one of them, actually. Mehmet became a father during this, in the middle of this chaos. But so 24,000 women were expected to deliver their babies within a month, and there is no official data about their situation now. We don't know what happened to those women. There are at least 1,000 children missing. Some were actually delivered to religious sects and communities. So affected region is also a host to refugees, as previous contributors told in the first session. According to UN, there were like 1.7 million refugees living in the quake-hit region, mostly from Syria. The government forces literally ignored their existence and their needs, leaving them completely to their own fate. And it's documented, for example, that some officials forced a group of refugees, mostly women and children, into a bus, destination of which is still unknown to us. So we heard about some cases that Syrian women did not make any sound when they're under the collapsed buildings because they assumed they would not be saved from the rubble if they spoke Arabic. So they're exposed to racist and anti-migrant provocations. They were blamed for stealing stuff. Some of them reported us that they were told by the police officers not to go out after 8 p.m. Otherwise, they would be shot by the police. So they actually declared the police have this right to or power to shoot immigrants and refugees. So they were threatened with their lives, denied taking dinner, for example, distributed after 7 p.m. So in other words, they were forced to starving, actually. So what is the current situation of women? So hundreds of thousands of people had to move temporarily or permanently to other parts of the country. Those who had to stay behind are trying to live in tent cities or in damaged or risky buildings. Some are still on the streets. The need for toilets was and still is vital, and women are choosing not to eat or drink anything so that they wouldn't have to go to the toilet. So they push the limits of human body by going to toilets once in a day preferably in the darkness of the night. So this in turn causes severe health issues. Vaginal and urinary infections are growing in number. Additionally, going to the toilet in the dark makes many women vulnerable to sexual or otherwise attacks. So most of them develop post-traumatic syndrome disorder, PTSD, and anxiety disorders. Unfortunately, it's a known fact that there happens an increase in the gender-based violence cases in post-disaster environments. So it has been almost 2 months now, and there is no place in the region for women to apply in case of such violations. Many courthouses were destroyed. There is no family courts in the region now that women can apply for violations or for divorce, for example, in case of violence or other things. So there is no protection mechanisms for women. So they actually were left alone in this sense either. So one gynecologist, I would like to give you one example, one little tiny example actually. One gynecologist who wants to keep her name secret. So it reported us that she saw 3 rape victims a day during her visit on the ground in the field, her work in the field. So one doctor, one limited district, and she saw 3 rape victims a day. So that's the frequency of gender-based violence, we can assume. We are, accordingly, let's say, we are getting more and more calls asking help for birth control, which is related to the previous case. So this is the real disaster, actually. So how we responded to this disaster, let's say, this nightmare. Ekmek ve Gül immediately mobilized women in its network. Some were already in the region. We formed a coordination on the very first day, and we installed containers and tents specific to women needs. Our tents for women's health actually were removed by the government forces in Iskenderun, but we are still doing our field work. These tents and containers open to women where they can find hygiene pads, tampons, and some basic medicine. Health workers in our network are voluntarily on the ground to carry medical screening. In the counter-strike, they're actually moving from village to village, and they're reporting us the medical condition of women. For example, today's report said that 90% of women in Iskenderun region are having vaginal fungal infections. It's just a limited field research conducted by, Ekmek ve Gül, one Ekmek ve Gül group team. So psychologists, pediatricians, and social workers who are Ekmek ve Gül volunteers are going to the region to provide psychosocial support. So we set up tents for children, tents we call it, as definitely opposed to the religious affairs and religious community tents. They opened actually Quran courses in tents for children of age 4 to 6. So children who are already traumatized, having no access to decent food, water, clean water, or shelter, but they were provided with traumatizing religions, so-called education. So it will take a very long time for women and children to overcome this disaster. So all these works, we will need an ongoing support here. This is what we are working hard to organize now, and why we comfortably appeal to our friends and especially sisters in all around the world. The living conditions of women, first of all, in the region should be known everywhere, because that the government, Turkish government, is lying about the situation. So that they had to deal with real, concrete sexism in the ground, in the field, in the region, and capitalist greed, even in such a disastrous moment. So we would love to strengthen our communication with women's organizations all around the world now. So that was our motto for this 8th of March. Actually, we survived upon solidarity, and we're gonna change the world by getting organized. So long live international solidarity, and thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Fulya. Thank you so much for your insightful talk, actually. Before I introduce our third speaker, Mehmet Türkmen, I want to make another announcement about translation. I'm so sorry, it's a little bit confusing. So if you, like English speakers on the Zoom, you need to join to English interpretation channel to listen to translation of Mehmet Türkmen's talk. So you need to click on the globe icon and then choose the English channel. And I think Mehmet Türkmen is in the Turkish channel now. So if Ekim can confirm me, that would be great. And let me introduce you, Mehmet Türkmen. He founded the United Textile Weaving and Leather Workers Union, Birteksan in Turkish. He is Birteksan's Gaziantep region representative and works as a carpet weaver. He has been in the working class struggle for a very long time, and recently he criticized the employers forcing the workers to work, and the removal of tents in the city center after the earthquake that occurred in Defne district of Hatay on February 20th. And he was summoned to give a statement to the security branch director, and they claimed that he publicly disseminated false information with the motive of creating anxiety, fear and panic among the public. So his presentation will focus on Birteksan's organization in the earthquake affected areas. Again, I want to remind you, English speakers, please join the English channel and then listen to his presentation there. Thank you.
Sesim geliyor mu? Yayında mıyım acaba?
Can you hear me? Am I
Yes, you
live
are.
now?
Evet. Evet. Başlayabilirsiniz.
Tamam.
And can everyone hear the English translation clearly?
Yes.
Okay.
Başlıyorum o zaman.
I'm starting then.
Herkese merhaba.
Hello
Amerika'da
everybody.
ve başka yerlerden bizi dinleyen ve bütün katılımcıları
Our
saygıyla
listeners and
selamlıyorum.
participants from the US and all over the world, say hello.
Ben biraz tabii şöyle hem kısaca Birteksan sendikasından bahsedeceğim. Çünkü bu yeni ve bağımsız bir sendika. Birteksan
I will briefly talk about
nasıl
Birteksan
kuruldu?
syndicate, about its establishment.
Devamında biraz deprem bölgesindeki işçi profilinden,
Afterwards,
deprem
I will
bölgesinin
talk about workers,
aynı zamanda büyük bir işçi havzası olduğundan bahsedeceğim. Bu konuda bilgiler vereceğim. Daha sonra da deprem sürecinde bu bölgedeki işçilerin depremden nasıl etkilendiği hakkında, burada yaşanan hak ihlalleri ve deprem süreci boyunca işçi sınıfı cephesinde bu bölgede yaşananları anlatmaya çalışacağım. Ve son olarak da bu süreçte Birteksan olarak nasıl bir faaliyet yürüttüğümüzden, nasıl bir çalışma yürüttüğümüzden bahsedeceğim. Umarım
the United Textile Weaving and Leather Workers Union. I hope I'll be able to do it in the given time.
Birteksan sendikası bir yıl önce Şubat ayında kuruldu.
Ama
aylar önce başlamıştı kuruluş çalışmaları. Birteksan'ın kuruluş amacı ve kuruluş nedeni aslında biraz şöyle. Bu bölge büyük bir işçi havzası. Başta Antep, yani benim de yaşadığım ve
has a
sendikanın da genel
great,
merkezinin olduğu
has a
il,
big
kurulduğu il
pool of
Gaziantep
workers.
şehri.
There are lots of
Sadece tekstil iş kolunda
workers that
130-140
live in the
bin
region.
işçi
Just in
çalışıyor
textile, we have
ve
around
ayrıca bu bölgede
130,000 workers
Antep'e de
that
yakın
reside
olan
in the region.
Malatya, Maraş, Urfa,
Cities like
Batman,
Maraş,
Adıyaman gibi illeri de
Malatya,
dahil
Urfa, Batman that are
ettiğimizde
close to Antep.
300
Once we
binden
include these
fazla
cities too, we
tekstil
have a
işçisinin
workforce,
yaşadığı bir havza,
textile
büyük bir iş
workforce that
havzası.
makes up more than
Tekstil iş
300,000
kolu
people.
daha emek yoğunluklu ve ucuz iş gücüne dayanan bir iş.
Textile industry requires hard labor, and at many times because Kurds are the majority in many parts of the region, they make up the cheap labor in the textile industry. Many of the bosses and capital owners, they get government subsidies when they're investing in the region. And many international textiles so international companies also invest, and the workers are forced to work for very low wages, amounting to slavery conditions and under harsh working conditions. Predominantly Antep, especially in Antep, there's a long history of struggle among textile workers in the region that go back many years. In fact, some of these activities are so significant to be seen as important moments in the global workers' movement. For example, in 1996, textile workers in Ünalde region carried out a resistance that included more than 20,000 participants. Also in Başpınar organized industrial area, thousands of workers went on a strike. All of these workers' resistance and organization workers wanted to solidify their gains through these struggles, and the only way to do this, as you know, is to form your union and to organize under a union. There are currently 3 textile syndicates that represent the majority of the workers in the industry. Unfortunately, all of these 3 syndicates have been betraying the workers.
Unfortunately, yellow labor unionism is very dominant in the textile sector. And I have been in the labor struggle since my youth. And starting from my first years, I have been in the labor unions, especially in the textile labor union of Revolutionary Federation of Confederation of Labor Unions. We have been trying to organize the laborers and bring them to the administration. But unfortunately, there was a lot of treason by the yellow labor unions. And 1.5 years ago, we decided to establish Bir-Teksen. Bir-Teksen was born as a reaction towards this bureaucratic labor unionism. And starting from Antep and again in Urfa, in the last 25 years, 25, 30 years, there were a lot of very important strikes and labor actions. And leaders of those actions established our labor union. And after our foundation, in February, in Antep, in more than 25 factories, more than 25,000 workers went on a strike, and we played a very important role with significant gains. And in the couple of months in Antep, in textile sector, more than 30,000 workers were sacked very recently, and we struggled against that. And now we're going through a period of earthquake disasters. I hope you can hear my voice. I hope everything is going well.
Yes, we can hear you, Eren.
Now, during the earthquake process, the destruction brought by the earthquake, the responsibility of the ruling party, I think these topics are unnecessary to go into detail because you already know. But as I have said, in the region, there are hundreds of thousands of workers, and many of them are working in the textile sector. And since the workers are the poorest sections of the society, they are forced to live in very insecure buildings that were prone to collapse during the earthquake. That's why the working class has paid a heavy price because of the earthquake. Unfortunately, tens of thousands workers and their families lost their lives, but this was not the only loss. Right after the earthquake began the rights violations against the workers. Primarily, right after the earthquake, especially in Antep, Urfa, and followingly in Malatya, in other cities, people were called to go back to the factory. Maybe we didn't have so much destruction in the city center of Antep, relatively. There were workers whose houses were destroyed, whose relatives died, who were forced to migrate to other cities, who couldn't find even a single tent. They were invited back to their factories, and many of the factories threatened them by sacking if they don't come back to their workplaces, and they were actually sacked. This was one dimension of it. And the other one was that despite the fact that the employers told the workers, invited the workers back to the factories, there were many workers who couldn't go back to the factories because of their injuries, and they lost a lot of paydays. They couldn't receive any payments, so they are unemployed virtually. So we have seen similar situations in the past. The workers have been victimized previously. So right after the earthquake, we have mobilized all our members. We have come together with all the workers working in those factories, and we prepared a list of our demands. And one of our demands was that in all the earthquakes-torn cities, there should be a ban on sacking the workers for at least 10 months, because there will be the huge victimization of the workers. And second demand was that there were a lot of workers who would be unable to go to work, and they should be allowed to take a leave, take a paid leave. And unfortunately, we were the only single union which raised those demands. And unfortunately, our demands were not met. We have distributed our demands in Antep, and to a certain extent, our demands were met by a decree issued by the government. They applied a ban on sacking the workers, and they decided to regulate the workers' wages, but in practice, they didn't implement. For example, they applied a ban on sacking the workers, but there was an article which also regulated, which also said that if the workers behave improperly or misbehave, they could also be sacked without any compensation. This was the same case during the COVID pandemic. When this is the case, this ban on sacking the workers have become the employer's freedom to sack workers, and a lot of workers were sacked. And also absenteeism become a reason to sack the workers. There was an article which regulated that the workers who could not come to the workplace could easily be sacked. So this is the best reason for the employers. And during a pandemic, during a disaster, it's very normal for the workers to be unable to attend. So the article practically said that you cannot sack the workers unless you can sack them without paying any compensation. In Antakya, in Maraş, in Urfa, in majority of the cities, hundreds, maybe thousands of workers were sacked without any payment. That's why we continue to repeat our demand. We said that this also should find its rightful place in the regulation, and there should be a total ban on sacking any workers. This is one of the most urgent demands of the workers. Another one is the payment for the short-term works. And this was ineffective because during the earthquake, there were conditions which made the workers unable to benefit from such kind of short-term payments, because it was upon the application of the employers, not the employees. So it was up to the mercy of the employers to ask for such kind of compensation from the state for short-term work. And there was another condition which also said that the factory must be damaged by the earthquake. And apart from a couple of examples, there were almost no factories damaged by the earthquake. It was mainly the houses of the workers that were destroyed and collapsed after the earthquake. And you are making such a regulation in which there is a condition that the factory facility must be harmed. So naturally, no employer wanted to take advantage of such a regulation. And apart from this, as mentioned by Fulya, as I think it was in the video of Ekmek ve Gül, a woman comrade mentioned this. On 28 February, there was another earthquake in Malatya, and in Shantun Textile, a factory located in the region. And by the way, we have seen more than 100 buildings collapsed and thousands of workers died once again. So the workers wanted to leave the factory, but the employers locked the factory gates and they didn't allow the workers to leave the factory during the earthquake. In another region, we knew that there was a damaged facility, a factory building, but they managed to obtain some forged permits to continue their production. And in Malatya, for example, there was a factory building which partly collapsed, but employer invited all the workers to go back to workplace, and he threatened them. And workers were caught during the earthquake. One of them lost their lives and 4 of them were heavily injured. In Hatay, right after the first quake, there was a second one, and it was 5.3, I think. And it was just 2 weeks after the main earthquake. Many workers were forced to go back to work. And if they couldn't come, they were sacked. That's why we went to the workers' neighborhoods. We issued calls not to go back to their factories. Thanks to our efforts, dozens of workers didn't go to their factories, and then employers yielded. In Malatya, there was a factory building where there were a lot of women workers. Right after the earthquake, employer issued a call and invited the workers to come back to the factory. And by the way, there were many workers whose families were killed, or workers themselves were killed. And the employer sent them a letter telling that they will be sacked if they don't come back to their workplaces. And as a result, we managed to have them take a step back. And in Adana, another example, for example, Adana is one of the cities that was least impacted by the earthquake, but the bosses took this as an opportunity. And there was a factory where more than 300 workers were employed. Right after earthquake, the boss said that we are going to shut down the company. And he sacked more than 300 workers without any payments, without any compensation. And in some of the cases, only 10% of the deserved compensation was offered to the workers. And the workers, unfortunately, undersigned the contracts, such contracts, out of fear. But some of the workers contacted us, who didn't undersign, contacted us, and we intervened. And for more than 3 weeks, together with Mardin confectionery, Mardin textile workers, in front of the factory, in front of their retailer shops, we have organized very impactful actions. And by yesterday evening, the bosses were forced to take a step back, and all of the workers, including the workers who undersigned the contract, will be paid their compensations and whatever must be paid to them. So what I was trying to say is that Birteksen, right after the earthquake took place at 4:17 in the morning, and we have a very large association building together with the association. We went to the field together with our volunteers and workers, starting from the first day. Especially in Gaziantep city center, we have organized aid and assistance activities, and we are going to enhance our activities in a way to cover all the other cities. We have organized an assistant aid activity that covered thousands of people, and we are a very recently established labor union. But thanks to our volunteers, we managed to undertake such an effort. We did not only provide aid to the relatives and workers themselves, we have also fought for the rights of the workers. For example, in Antep, right after the earthquake, when the production began, there were a series of strikes, work stoppages in a series of factories, because the earthquake was a period when the workers should have been receiving their increased wages, but taking the earthquake as an opportunity, the bosses decided to reject to pay this increase. In Ahenkalı factory, for example, workers became a member of our labor union. There was a work stoppage. I mean, an illegal strike took place for 1 week. And under the leadership of our labor union, the workers began working together with an increase in their wages. So we did not only provide aid and assistance for the earthquake victims, we also struggled together with the workers in the face of all kinds of right violations. What about the other labor unions? KESK and DISK labor unions were in the field, and they have organized some aid activities in proportion to their powers. But apart from them, there were no labor unions that were as active as our labor union that could provide assistance. It has become clearly obvious that a fighting labor union like Birteksen was short in supply, was urgently needed. So workers need to organize not only for wage increases, but for their lives, for their basic rights and freedoms. On the one hand, we were trying to heal the wounds of this earthquake, but on the other hand, we were trying to bring the capitalist exploitation system to account, and we will continue to organize, we will continue to do our best to organize the workers. Now, this will be the end of my speech. Maybe I can receive questions afterwards. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for your contribution and for your inspired talk. So I want to introduce our fourth and final speaker, Mustafa Şala. He has been working as a miner for more than 16 years in Soma, which is a town and district of Manisa province in the Aegean region of Turkey. And he was also one of the members of the search and rescue teams in Hatay, as you all know, and is like mentioned earlier today. Hatay was one of the most severely damaged province by the February 6 earthquakes. And today he will share his observations from the field with us. And you can start when you're ready. Please unmute yourself. And I think we fixed the interpretation issue, the problem, I guess now. So English speakers, if you stay on the English channel, you will hear the translation. And if you want to listen Mustafa Şala in Turkish, please join the Turkish channel. Click on the globe icon and then please choose the language. Select the language there. Floor is yours.
Greetings, everybody. I am Mustafa Şala. As you mentioned, I've been a mining technician in Soma for the past 16 years. Firstly, my greetings to my fellow miners, compañeros here before the earthquake. Before the earthquake, in Soma, we had different events that produced similar effects and results. In Soma, we have a big area of coal mining where 20,000 miners are employed. Nearly 50,000 people are employed in the industry in Soma. Until the 2000s, the production was mostly public, but in the past 2 decades, the industry has been privatized and private companies have been running most of the industry, coal industry and energy industry there. As part of the policies regarding energy, the areas in Soma, which have a great vast potential for mining, these companies are extensively working. If we are to name some of these companies, Torku, Koç Groups, Iron Exports, Coal Construction, Turkey's largest companies are working actively in Soma. In 2014, there was a great mining tragedy where we lost 301 miners. When we evaluate this event, we get an idea. We see how those in power employ similar techniques in maintaining and going through these processes. First, prior to the accident, lack of provision, this pressure to overproduce for the sake of extra profit, the greed for money, for leading to disregard for safety concerns. Many of these points continued to take place similarly, even in the earthquake process. So there are many parallels. in a country where 301 miners were lost, not even one miner is supposed to lose their lives afterwards. For example, having lost so many souls in the 99 earthquake, we are we can think that we're not supposed to have repetitions of these tragedies, but we see that in our faith, we see this repetition of tragedies. In Soma, we had hundreds of miners losing their lives in an occupational murder. And now, if we are to talk about the earthquake, the recent earthquake, it would be sufficient for me to address certain points. I'll share some of our experiences. As 2,500 miners from Soma, we traveled to the earthquake hit region. I was part of the team of 100 miners that arrived in Hatay on the third night after the earthquake. When we went there, we were told that when we go there, we would contact AFAD, the state's emergency directorate, and they will lead you in this process. We went there with our, digging equipment, search and rescue vehicles. We went into the military site where there's AFAD officials. We started talking to them. We said, hello, we were coming from Soma. They said, hello, welcome. We said, so what are we doing? How are we coordinating and organizing the efforts? How are you going to lead us? They said, we're not going to lead you direct to anywhere. You're just going to go out and find the first rubble that you run into and start digging. We said, how? And they said, this is all we can say. Just leave us the phone number, take your equipment, and go out there and start doing kind of wooed us away from the area. Then that was a good indicator for us, actually, of the experiences. We kind of stole some of their tents. We took 20 tents from their military center, and then we went to a nearby area which is called 600 houses. The district is called that, and there are nearly 600 residences in the area. The initial images were like scenes out of a movie, many buildings destroyed, families making fires in between the rubbles, waiting hopelessly. There were only 2 working equipments and no lights, nobody in the middle of the night. We were thinking of planning to work once the sun rose, but we were in deep shock. So we just started walking around the collapsed residence. And we started working in the morning of the 4th day on removing the rubbles without any supervision. There were 4 volunteer groups, each made up of 15 to 20 miners. On the 4th day, were 60 buildings with 600 houses in each. We were able to work only on 10 buildings, remaining 50 buildings remain untouched until the 5th day, where more and more people began to join the rescue efforts. Initially, in our work breaks, we would wander around to observe, to see different parts of the city. There are parts of Hatay on the shore of the Asiri where we witnessed that people were waiting hopelessly without any rescue efforts going place, without any equipment in the region. I had given my phone number to those AFAD officials during our initial contact. They added my number to a WhatsApp group about coordinating rescue efforts in the city. For the first 3 days, we had 7,000 or 8,000 calls, citizens reporting that they couldn't access their loved ones. None of these were responded. Only on the 6th day, when we started to write some of responses ourselves, AFAD officials then started to send some responses. Okay, we're sending a unit there. We're looking for the necessary heating equipment. And mind you, this is like the 9th, 10th day almost after the earthquake. So there was a big lack of coordination, and many of the efforts on the ground had to depend on the initiative and the work of the volunteers without any coordination. Istanbul and Ankara metropolitan municipalities were relatively more organized during this protest. So this prevented certain social problems from getting worse on the ground in the initial days. From the first days until today, the biggest problem we've had is accommodation, heating, access to toilets. And unfortunately, these problems still continue and we haven't been able to resolve them. We left just 10 of us in the city, and the rest of us left, returned back to Afghanistan. We were supposed to return with a military plane, but we couldn't. We waited another additional day to be picked up by a civilian airplane. And when we were sitting in the airplane with one of the officials came and said, "Do you see this airport?" And I said, "Yes, I see it." And he said, "This used to be Amik Lake back in the day." He said, "Well, we knew this used to be a Amik plane, but we didn't know the airport was established exactly on the site of a lake." So, as you may know, Amik Lake was dried from 1950 to 1970s. And many of the areas that surround it are swamps that extend from the neighborhoods of Iskenderun, with the other side covering almost half of Hatay. So this swamp that was dried and was used for agricultural use initially was later open to construction, and eventually the airport itself was built on this dried up swamp. So I began to dig deeper into it, to research more. And only 1 month before the earthquake, they had a huge flooding event that took place in the airport. So it's a state policy. What we are seeing is, or the lack thereof, of a state policy that centers humans and their right to live and right to accommodation. It's the state perspective that ignores all of these rights. Today, experts, scientists, occupational organizations are seen as the enemy by the government in power. Whenever they voice their opposition, there's a counter propaganda that targets them. The doctors' union, the civil engineers' union, they all have been declared as sort of like the enemies of the state by the state. However, we won't solve any of these problems if the people directly impacted by these problems are in the decision-making processes. We've had numerous earthquakes from Erzincan and Lazio decades ago, and we will continue to have these problems from 5-10 years from now, just like how 9 years after the Soma massacre, we had a similar massacre that took place in Zonguldak. If you're going to ask me about Soma, mining conditions have not changed in Soma compared to, let's say, 10-15 years ago. If there's a major accident here 6 months from now, none of us should be surprised, because it's the same companies that operate with the same profit drive, with even more state support in this process, with the money they receive from electricity production that's that operates through the dollar. People do not have many other available options. More than 20,000 workers that exist in this industry will continue to work in the industry. But they demand humane work conditions, decent pay, and we are struggling for in the struggle for this. We continue this struggle as much as we can in our given capabilities. Now, these are my observations about the earthquake, and I greet all of you once again.
Thank you so much. I want to thank everyone in this session. Thank you for sharing your experiences and observations from the field. I don't want to take time, so I just want to open the floor right now for the questions or like comments. You can write your comments and question in the chat box, and or if you want to like ask your question, you can raise your hand and unmute yourself and ask your question. And also, Kim, I can't follow YouTube channel. If there's like any questions there, can you please let me know? Okay, thank you. So is there any questions or comments? Okay, I guess I can start then. I have a question to Holden. I'm wondering, could you please, if possible, elaborate more on your fighting strategies against like real estate lobbies in Albany, New York?
Sure. My organization is much more of like a grassroots collective organizing. We organize tenant associations, and we're building a tenant union here in Brooklyn. So we comment, like we will comment on what happens in Albany, but that's not really our particular concern, because we understand that the disorganization in the working class as our primary like obstacle or primary project, and we don't really understand Albany to be like our site of struggle very much at this point. I don't think we can comprehensively put forth our platform, our program, without actually having a base of actual working class tenants. So not to dodge the question, but we work a little bit of a different direction.
Yeah, thank you so much. I understand your point, Holden. I think Ekin has a question. Ekin, if you're ready, you can unmute yourself. Ekin, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, I just write the question in English and Turkish.
Sorry?
Soruları İngilizce ve Türkçe beraber yazdım chat'te.
Okay. Okay. There's a question in the chat. Thanks for precious presentations. I'm an organizer in New York at New York Earthquake Solidarity. What would you suggest us to do abroad regarding politically empowering earthquake victims? We are reaching our international comrades to call for support. However, what our friends on the ground need? Who wants to answer to this question? And
There's a question in the chat box, but is it
Yes,
for
evet.
all the speakers?
Yes, for all the speakers. You can answer the question.
Then I can
Please.
answer this one.
Then I'm going to answer. One of our friends told us that he is an organizer in the NY Earthquake Solidarity, and what would you suggest us to do abroad regarding politically empowered earthquake victims? Now, there is this following picture here. We talked about the rights violations of the workers, but the destruction is huge here, especially in some certain provinces. Probably we are going to be facing housing and sheltering problems for the coming years, especially in Maraş, Adıyaman, Malatya, Antakya. Starting from the very first day of the earthquake, there were some very basic needs, like food,
including hygiene,
and then hygiene, housing, container tents.
For a long time,
they will remain as basic needs, and we still need
regarding these issues to continue.
A solidarity. We have seen a very big solidarity, an international one, actually, but we should not forget the fact that this is an earthquake that has been experienced in Turkey. If this were an earthquake in a normal country, a country which could take at least the basic precautions, basic measures in the face of such kind of natural disasters, maybe we could heal some of the wounds. But this is Turkey. Maybe years after the earthquake, there will still be people living in containers, living in tents. They will be still unable to meet their basic needs. So we have to consider the fact that this is a country like Turkey. Solidarity with poor people, solidarity with workers, solidarity with victims of earthquake is hugely important. And associations, labor unions, democratic civil organizations should act in coordination with each other. Maybe you should base your solidarity efforts on such kind of organizations. Maybe it was explained by our previous speakers before. You know about the state institutions and how they abuse and misuse any efforts for solidarity. In order to heal the wounds of the workers and their families, this is very important. And issues of refugees. Only in Antep, we have more than 500,000 Syrians, and majority of them are without any papers. They're working illegally, and they are the biggest victims of the earthquake. And unfortunately, they were unable to benefit the aid provided. As a labor union, we were also trying to organize our solidarity for the refugees and Syrian immigrants. Starting from our establishment, we are orienting our activities towards the refugees particularly. We are issuing our written statements in Arabic as well. That's why it's very important to organize a solidarity together with such kind of organizations and keep it international. Thanks very much.
Did you hear the translation?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you, Emre. And we're coming towards the end, but I think we can take one more question, and I think Hazal has a question. And then Fulya. Yeah, Hazal.
I'm not sure. Okay, I'm sticking with English because my question will be to Fulya and Mehmet in particular, because they've been presenting a lot about Antep, and this is where I'm based right now. And my presentation in the first half of the event has also been largely about Antep. And I'm especially in the light of this long-term needs that Mehmet just mentioned that will persist for a long time, and the need in the light of those long-term needs for a collaborative effort beyond the state institutions that obviously failed. I mean, like, notwithstanding the efforts that you both presented about Nar Sanat in Antep, Bir Tek Sen and EMEP and like all those organizations acting collectively, I'm wondering your thoughts about like the potentials for a larger like collective that encompasses and forces of labor and democracy in Antep and beyond. Because there's, I mean, to my expectations in comparison to 99 earthquake, like there is kind of a lack of this kind of a larger collaborative effort among different unions, chambers of various professions and political parties and so on. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about like potentials for establishing a larger collective that goes beyond the institutions that you just mentioned. And also I'm curious, like with Mehmet's own history, like or recent history of being criminalized on the grounds of like his statements concerning like the state's failure in providing relief efforts. I'm curious how these kind of like state interventions influence potentials for establishing this kind of larger solidarity or failures in doing so. Thank you.
Thank you, Hazal. Fulya, if you don't mind, do you want to go first? So we can give like some time to our translators. That's why. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Put my opinion on the concept of disaster capitalism. So I'm not sure if there was an ongoing debate, the conceptual debate about disaster capitalism as put by Naomi Klein's valuable work of the shock doctrine. I think we should make a distinction of the concepts of two possible conceptualization of disaster capitalism. So one is that there is no such capitalism free of creating disaster. So there's no disaster-free capitalism. There is no one single period in the history of capitalism that didn't create disaster or help contributing to natural transformation of your turning natural events to social disasters. So all we can say about monopoly capitalism has invented new ways of how to profit from disasters. So if this specificity needs a new concept such as disaster capitalism, so that's the limit of the concept, I guess, because otherwise we would find ourselves in the dilemma between creating nature, urban life friendly capitalism, educating, training capitalism for the good of nature and for people, or destroying capitalism, which is intrinsically creating disasters, social disasters. So I would like, I'm on the second page by the way. I'm in favor of destroying capitalism. The same dilemma is also in front of women's movement. You know, is it possible to create a women-friendly capitalism? So maybe making capitalism subject to some kind of feminist education or training to create a feminist capitalism, as analytical feminists and COD would argue, for example, or we conceptualize capitalism as intrinsically as an enemy system. So we should destroy capitalism. The idea of then we come up with the idea that we should destroy capitalism. So this dilemma is, I think, important for the future as well. Another point I would like to mention is that the debate of NGOization of the field, hit by the earthquakes. So we should put some differences, as one contributor did say in the first session. At least between at least 3 types of NGOs. So one, rights-based NGOs with rights-based approaches. Second, charity organizations, which are mostly related to business circles and mostly free of taxes, let's say, because whenever they put some charity on a social disaster, they also get a discount of taxes in their values, you know. And 3 type is religious missionary activities. So both, all of them are working in the field now. So this is important. These distinctions are also important because our friends abroad should be aware that which types of NGOs they are building solidarity with. If we come to the Kim's question, I guess, right? So the recovery will take a long time. Now everyone's attention is very vivid, but it's gonna be, we know that it's gonna be decreasing on the decreasing trend as the time passes. So we need to keep this attention very solid, and we actually strengthen our networks, especially rights-based organizations working specific to children, women, and working class people in general. So that were the real victims of these disasters of earthquakes. So that would be our recommendation. And thanks for asking and listening my contributions again.
Julia, that was your contribution that you want to make before, right? You on disaster capitalism. Okay, I just want to make sure. And Hazal, could you please briefly ask your question again for Mehmet Türkmen, if possible?
Yeah, of course. Just not to take so much of time, my question was particularly about the form of organizing that you have been describing in the specific case of Antep, and I happen to be based in Antep and have been doing research here for a while. And notwithstanding the efforts of Nar Sanat, EMEP, and Birteksen in coordinating relief efforts, I was curious about the potentials or lack thereof of organizing in a larger scale among the forces of labor and democracy in Antep and beyond, because I'm, from my limited perspective, observing some sort of a lack of organization among different unions, political parties, and local NGOs in terms of remaining at least in coordination in terms of the ongoing efforts about the earthquake relief. And I was curious, what do you think can be potential ways to expand the solidarity or potential limitations or barriers in front of achieving this? Thank you.
Soru için ayrıca bir çeviri olmayacak herhalde. Ama bir arkadaşımız Fulya kısaca özetlemiş soruyu. O kısmını düşünerek bir cevap vereyim. Anladığım kadarıyla yani burada Nar Sanat, Birteksen, Emek Partisi.
As far as I can understand, the question is whether the coordination between EMEP, Nar Sanat, Birteksen, whether it could be expanded to other institutions or other regions. Honestly, in these regions, in Antep as well, the ability to act together and collaborate on these activities, it's not a deep history, unfortunately. I mean, we do have a history of working together as the Labor and Democracy Forces platform in the region. We have some limited level and history of coordination, collaboration on special days. We were able to come together we made a call on the second day of the earthquake as Birtexten and MF and Birtexten to nearly 30 platforms in and around Antep so that we can coordinate our efforts together. And our comrade that participated in that coordination meeting, it is necessary for all these organizations to act together in these moments, but sometimes for the sake of this, for this attempt to coordinate can sometimes even limit the organization's ability to do anything. For example, representatives of 20 organizations suggested, oh, let's go to a neighborhood together and deliver the aid together. Such proposals neither increased the productivity of our efforts, nor was effective in delivering aid. So we objected. We said instead, let's identify the areas that need the most urgent aid. Let's identify these places where people cannot access so that we can communicate more efficiently. This Labor and Democratic Forces platform has a WhatsApp group, which was relatively more organized initially, that we would use to determine which neighborhoods needed help and what kind of help, you know, food related, hygiene related. For example, in the first month, we delivered nearly 8 to nearly 7,500 individuals every day. And we did this through this system, which had an extensive list of who needed most urgently. We probably could not reach this high level number of individuals if we were to try to collaborate our actions with more organizations. We reached more than 100 volunteers on the site to identify the most urgent needs. And other organizations that weren't as effective on organizing quickly like us, there wasn't, I guess, that harmony. For example, THP as a larger organizations with access to more resources, they closed down their storage area on the Thursday, saying that it was getting raided. However, people that were in this collective later came individually and participated in our efforts, similar for HDP volunteers. They were active on certain neighborhoods and we collaborated on the ground, similar with KES. Or could we not have done this coordination better? We could have, although our collaboration was not as well as desired. We had some limited amount. For example, if HDP said, oh, we need blankets or such and such in the specific location, they would let us know and we deliver what's needed. And vice versa, when we needed something and didn't have it, they would step in. For example, the teams in Antep, Maraş, Pazarcık, the tent sites that we set up there, we worked with other organizations. We also ran into obstacles there. When we try to create joint centers, we also ran into some obstacles that the state and its AFA directorate would impose on us. For example, the Solidarity Center in Narlı, we were a part of it initially, but soon after, also in Adıyaman, but soon after, AFA, the directorate, just seized these spaces and no longer gave us access to these sites. Therefore, each institution also had to take some autonomous organizing in this time of crisis, but we were able to maintain a limited level of coordination on the ground, despite this. I hope this was an adequate response.
Thank you so much. It's 3:30 now. I think we're out of time. I want to thank everyone, like our speakers and then everyone, our audience joining us online. And before ending this session, I want to thank our comrades from People's Forum, especially for their help with technical stuff. and our interpreters Eren Buralılar and Emre Şahin. Thank you for your amazing job. It was great. Thank you. And I just want to remind you, a quick reminder, strong solidarity is needed for the earthquake victims. Please consider donating to Hevasor and Research Institute on Turkey for the thousands of people who are facing homelessness and poverty in Kurdistan, Syria, and Turkey today. Thank you so much again, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
I think we're wrapping up. Thank you and goodbye.